The servant approached the Duke, asking what he wanted with him. Klaus de Baltazar was the Duke of the Lugvosset Empire. The man suddenly rose, cornering the servant and pinning him tightly against the wall. Because he wanted to confirm something, he inhaled the scent emanating from the servant, reminding him that he had already told him not to use that cologne. Although Antonio de Hessen claimed he wasn't wearing any perfume, the Duke thought he was being too insolent for someone working off a debt to him. Klaus was good at solving mysteries, and he was determined to uncover the secret this servant was hiding. Beads of sweat appeared on Antonio's face. She wondered if the Duke had already discovered that she was actually a woman. Klaus advised the servant not to try and hide things from him, because the more he thought about it, the more he wanted to dig deeper. Rosalia had disguised herself as a man to change the original plot, but it seemed to be more difficult than she had imagined. 3 months ago, our heroine stood in the middle of the room, watching her stepbrother smash an empty wine bottle. He yelled at Rosalia, telling her to bring more wine immediately because it was all gone. Rosalia de Hessen, the adopted daughter of Baron Hessen, just stood there silently, enduring his nonsense. He couldn't understand why she was penniless, as their father should have left her something. Rosalia glanced at Antonio, reminding him that he had squandered all the money without a penny to spare. But he just demanded that she go sell something valuable. Later, Baron Hessen passed away from illness, and it was then that the family's entire fortune went down the drain, while the son who should have prevented it all acted like a complete beast. Our heroine walked to the table, grabbed a sharp dagger lying there, and headed straight for Antonio. Although her brother trembled in fear, begging her to stay away, she was determined to end it all. Terrified, Antonio squeezed his eyes shut, screamed in horror, and covered his face, but the blow never came. When he opened his eyes, he saw Rosalia cutting off her own hair, because it was the only valuable thing she had left. She told her brother to sell the hair and then get lost. Antonio grabbed the hair, turned, and rushed out of the house, calling her a nasty piece of work as he left. This didn't even faze her, because she could be much worse when her life was on the line. Rosalia knew Antonio wouldn't be back, as loan sharks were waiting for him outside. Whether they did away with him or not, no one knew. That character never appeared in the story again. Although the clothes were a bit big, Rosalia put them on and rolled up the sleeve a little. And just like that, she took on a new identity, becoming Antonio de Hessen, in order to change her own destiny. Rosalia de Hessen was just a minor character who would dedicate her life to the Duke and then die. Who would have thought that this was the body our heroine was reborn into, and that she knew the Duke was about to come and take her as a servant? She had been here for 3 years, and she had been preparing for this moment ever since. She had no intention of falling head over heels for the Duke and then dying just like that, as written in the original novel. There were many ways to pay off the debt. She didn't have to run to Klaus de Baltazar and fall in love with him to do it. Just as in the original story, the Duke arrived at Baron Hessen's estate. The estate looked quite dilapidated, as no one had taken care of it for a long time. Even if Klaus sold it, he wouldn't get back half the money he had lent the Baron. The Duke's assistant, Alejandro, was reading a report which stated that the eldest son of the Hessen family, Antonio, had inherited the estate, and that, according to the documents, the Baron also had a daughter, Rosalia de Hessen. The Baron himself had passed away a few days ago from a serious illness. Just then, the heroine, dressed in men's clothing, came out to greet the Duke and introduced herself as the Baron's eldest son, Antonio de Hessen. He offered his hand to the Duke, but the Duke did not reciprocate. He stated coldly that he was here to collect a debt of 5,000 ballen from his father. The heroine was shocked that the Baron had borrowed such a large sum, enough to buy 3 mansions. The Duke wanted to know how Antonio planned to repay the rest of the money, since selling the estate would only fetch about 3,000 ballen. He confirmed the Duke's suspicion that he did not, in fact, have that much cash at the moment. However, he asked for a year's time, promising that he would definitely pay off the entire debt within that period. After a short pause, the Duke asked what Antonio planned to do. He had heard that this guy was expelled from the academy and had become a hopeless drunkard. According to Antonio, he hadn't been loitering in the back alleys for nothing. He had an ace up his sleeve. Although she didn't say it out loud, her ability was her knowledge of the novel's plot. The heroine knew the location of a crystal mine, which, according to the timeline, wouldn't be discovered for another 6 months. She also knew the location of a shipwreck full of treasure. But the easiest way to make money was through art, and the original protagonist, the Crown Princess, was fascinated by it. She would discover unknown artists, help them become famous, and make a fortune from it. All our heroine had to do was find them first. Antonio said he would use the information gathered on the streets, and is keen to scout for some art pieces. The Duke thought the idea sounded plausible, but he still didn't understand how the guy planned to pay for it all. Antonio considered it a reasonable question, as any business requires some startup capital. So he wanted to ask the Duke to lend him a mere 20 ballon. Klaus shot the guy a sharp glare and began to ponder. Antonio begged him to trust him and lend him the money just this once. He promised to show the Duke how he could magically turn 20 ballon into 500 ballon in just 2 months. Although Klaus still had his doubts, he decided to lend the money to this cheeky fellow, but on one condition. Antonio didn't even see the 2 large men appear beside him and grab his elbows. The terrified fellow began to struggle, begging to be let go and insisting he would definitely pay back the money. The Duke said he couldn't fully trust Antonio, as he might just be spouting nonsense. He asked where the fellow planned to live once the estate was sold, before the debt was paid off. The heroine froze, as she hadn't actually thought about that. Klaus decided to take Antonio at his word, but the fellow would pay off his debt under his supervision. He would work as a servant in the ducal mansion until the full amount was repaid. The heroine was devastated because she had tried so hard to avoid becoming the Duke's maid, only to end up as a disguised servant in his manor. In the Duchy of Baltazar, the room Antonio was assigned was far too nice for a servant. Alejandro said that de Hessen's role was slightly different from the other servants. Although Antonio was a servant of the ducal house, he was also the Duke's business partner. Moreover, the room was only 5 steps away from Baltazar's office. The man offered to give Antonio a tour of the entire estate. The only good thing in this mess was that she didn't have to sleep in the male servants' quarters. While touring the estate, she found it hard to breathe because she had bound her chest too tightly. Just then, a young lady ran by and bumped into the new servant, falling right into his arms. She was as light as a feather, like a small cloud. She huffed and asked how long the guy planned to hold her like that. When Antonio let her go, he guessed this must be Klaus's sister, Rosalia de Baltazar. Realizing he was the new servant, she looked him up and down, remarking that he was quite handsome. Since Chloe loved all things beautiful, she was making him her personal assistant starting today. There is a recent trend among noble ladies to have a charming servant by their side, basically for eye candy. Before Antonio could get a word in, Chloe's personal maid appeared in the hallway, telling the servant to be ready to accompany her to a meeting tomorrow. She shook off her maid and ran away. Antonio was left standing there, completely stunned, without even a chance to object. Alejandro, however, said he was lucky, remarking that winning the lady's favor on the first day was a great fortune. That night, the heroine collapsed onto her bed, thinking back on the day's events. She definitely didn't have time to trail after this seemingly self-centered young lady. She needed to pay the Duke back 500 ballon in 2 months, or he would make them pay dearly. Speaking of which, Alejandro was supposed to have brought the 20 ballon the Duke had promised, but he hadn't shown up yet. The heroine longed for a bit of peace, as it was her first day at the ducal manor. She felt extremely uncomfortable and just wanted to loosen the chest binding for a while. It was already late, so Alejandro probably wouldn't come until tomorrow. Wriggling free from the thing, the heroine fell onto the bed, finally able to breathe. The girl relaxed, thinking no one would barge into her room this late. But just then, there was a knock on the door, and the startled heroine leaped out of bed, grabbing the nearby bandages and trying to wrap herself up again, but she was making a mess of it. Thinking it was Alejandro in her haste, she opened the door a crack, only to find the Duke standing there. It turned out the assistant had been delayed, so Klaus had come to deliver the money himself. Entering the room, the Duke couldn't understand for the life of him why Antonio was clutching a huge vase. The servant explained that it was in the way and he was just trying to move it. Klaus held out an envelope with the promised cash, but the fellow couldn't take it as his hands were full. Antonio refused the offer to put the vase down, claiming he hadn't decided on the best place for it yet. He suggested just tucking the envelope under the plant. The next day, just as they had planned, Cosette headed to the reception with her new servant. she suddenly asked Antonio for his forgiveness. She was annoyed that her brother valued money so much that he had no compassion. So, as a representative of the ducal family, she was apologizing on his behalf. Although Antonio said she didn't have to, Cosette felt the whole thing was wrong. She had a feeling that Klaus would get into big trouble in the future. Then Chloe just smiled and told Antonio not to worry, because as long as he was by her side, no one would dare mess with him. The girl promised to protect him, as he was now part of her personal team. That evening, Chloe invited Antonio to have dinner with her. Although he doubted a servant was allowed to do such a thing, the girl didn't think it was a big deal, since he was a nobleman too. No sooner had she said that than she realized Klaus was standing right behind her. Without speaking to her brother, she turned and told Antonio to follow her. The Duke noted that the fellow looked quite relaxed. He wondered if Antonio had already gathered the 500 ballon, since he had time to hang around with his sister all day. Antonio simply reminded him that the Duke had given him 2 months. Klaus argued that even if Antonio started now, it would be impossible to raise all the cash in time. He told him not to worry, adding that he was just a servant in this house and couldn't disobey the young lady's orders. With that, Antonio bowed and left. Inwardly, she was annoyed by the Duke's arrogant attitude, as if his fearsome glare could intimidate anyone. As Antonio turned to leave, he didn't see a servant carrying a vase. They collided, and the water from the vase spilled all over him. Cosette rushed to Antonio's side, checking to see if he was hurt. He insisted he was fine and just needed to change his clothes. Suddenly, the Duke's voice came from behind, asking if Antonio was injured. With de Hessen's clothes wet, the bandages under his shirt became visible. The heroine clutched her chest, desperately trying to think of an excuse. Meanwhile, the Duke kept pressing, wanting to know what the bandages were for if Antonio wasn't hurt. The heroine felt the intense gazes of both Klaus and Cosette on her, but her mind went blank. Just then, Lady de Baltazar suddenly claimed that Antonio was injured because of her. According to Cosette, she had slipped while getting out of the carriage recently, and he had rushed to help, falling himself in the process. The lie was so convincing that the Duke didn't doubt her words for a second. Looking at the girl, the heroine thanked her in her heart for the help. However, the moment she met Cosette's eyes, it seemed as if she had seen through everything. Since Antonio was injured because of his sister, the Duke apologized for it. But Cosette got angry with him for it, protesting why Klaus was apologizing for her business. And when the Duke asked if his sister had hurt herself, she snapped back, asking when he had suddenly started caring about her. In that moment, the heroine felt as if she were caught between 2 tigers ready to tear each other apart. As the Duke turned to leave, he told Antonio not to overexert himself, as his body wasn't really his own to control until he paid off his debt. After he left, Cosette was furious with her brother, shocked that he could say such a thing. Antonio asked the young lady why she had helped him. According to Cosette, she did it because she saw the deep worry etched on his face. Besides, she had promised to protect Antonio from that cold-blooded tyrant. To Cosette, it didn't matter why he was wearing bandages. Maybe Antonio had some scars he didn't want anyone to see. Or whatever the reason, he was clearly having a hard time in that moment. Suddenly remembering something, Cosette turned to de Hessen and said that the Marquis's daughter was hosting a tea party soon, and all he had to do was stand next to her and look handsome. So he should go change into some dry clothes now before he caught a cold. The next day, Rosalia, disguised as Antonio as usual, arrived in Algros. In the heart of this village was the first painting she planned to get her hands on. In the original story, the protagonist found her first piece of art here and began supporting unknown artists from then on. Somewhere in the market square, there was supposed to be a man selling paintings. But no matter how much Antonio looked, he just couldn't find him. An old woman selling vegetables asked if he was looking for something in particular. Antonio asked her if there was a man selling paintings around here. The old woman thought he was talking about Abello, but she hadn't seen him in a long time. If the fellow was so curious about what happened to the painter, he could just go to his house and see for himself. The old woman said that Abello's door had roses on it. A little while later, our heroine finally found the house. She knocked hard on the door for a long time, but for some reason, no one answered. Convinced that the painter must be in this village, she pounded on the door, demanding they open up. Finally, the door flew open, and the owner wanted to know what on earth was going on. Abello O'Hanton wanted to know who in the world was knocking on his door like that. Just then, Antonio spotted a painting behind him. It depicted a woman and a girl in a blooming rose garden, exactly the same as in the original novel. Now certain he was in the right place, Antonio turned on the charm and asked if Mr. Abello lived here. He said he had come across the artist's work by chance and had now come to visit him in person. But before Antonio could introduce himself, the door was slammed shut in his face. He started knocking again, pleading with Mr. Abello to talk to him. Suddenly, Antonio noticed a little blonde girl watching him from around the corner of the house. But the moment the child realized she'd been seen, she turned and ran. Antonio crouched down next to her, asking if she lived in this house and why she was wandering around outside alone. But her mom had told her not to talk to strangers. Now that she thought about it, she shouldn't have gotten her hopes up while in man mode. Antonio apologized for scaring her and stood up, promising to leave at once. But he heard the little girl crying behind him. It was only now, looking around, that she finally realized the house was clearly empty and that no one was taking care of this child. Meanwhile, the Duke and his assistant arrived in Algros. Alejandro didn't understand why His Grace wanted to build a school in this small town. But Klaus argued that it was more than just a small town, as it was on the merchant's route between the capital and the duchy. Since everything was concentrated in the capital, this town was also developing and would prosper even more in the future. Since there was already an academy for nobles, it would be best to build a school for the middle class and commoners as well. Alejandro was amazed by his master's brilliant mind, as he had been the top of his class at the academy. After all, just as the Duke suggested they check out the market, Antonio walked past him from behind in the same square. He stopped in front of a shop window displaying women's wigs. Meanwhile, Abello was drinking yet another bottle of wine, while his little daughter, Erlin, sat by the window watching the yard. Suddenly, she saw a beautiful blonde woman walking toward their house. Thinking it was her mother, Erlin jumped off her chair and ran as fast as she could to the door. She rushed into the yard and threw herself into the arms of the disguised heroine, whose getup really made her look like her mother. Abello ran out after his daughter, apologizing to the girl for the misunderstanding. He tried to explain to little Erlin that this wasn't actually her mother. Consoling his crying daughter, Abello explained that his wife had passed away a while ago. Rosalia smiled and told him there was no need to apologize. In about a month, Abello was supposed to meet the original protagonist, the crown princess, at the market. As Rosalia had correctly deduced, he must have seen his late wife in the crown princess. So she decided to wear a wig the same color as the crown princess's hair, just in case. The heroine knelt before Erlin, saying she was sorry the girl had mistaken her for her mother. The little one looked at the girl closely and replied that it was okay. She said her mom had charming blue eyes, but up close they didn't look alike at all. Olin turned to her dad and asked when her mom was finally coming home. It broke my heart to see Abello deceiving his daughter with these lies. He asked her to hold on a little longer. I have to apologize for that scene just now. By the way, what are you doing in a place like this? You don't look like someone who would just wander into this kind of neighborhood. My mind was racing about the painting, and I was desperately trying to come up with a believable excuse. But just then, Abello asked if I was here to buy a painting from him. He thought I was with the person who had come by earlier. Before I could answer, the painter invited me inside to talk. After pouring me a cup of tea, Abello apologized for the mess in his house. The tea smelled wonderful, she said, but her eyes kept darting to the painting. Behind the painter, Abello noticed and guessed she must really like the piece of art. When he asked about her relationship with Antonio, she replied that he was her older brother. The painter glanced at his daughter, sighed heavily, and explained that this painting was his last work after his wife's death. After finishing it, he never painted anything again or even left the house. But seeing Erlin rush to greet the girl a few minutes ago, Abello began to understand something. He realized that he wasn't the only one who was lonely, and he wasn't the only one who had been suffering all this time. It was only in that moment that the man understood his daughter was in an even more difficult situation. After a pause, Abello suddenly announced that he would sell her the painting. The girl wanted to know if he was sure, as the piece seemed to mean a lot to him. The painter thought he had been too self-centered, clinging to this painting and unable to move on. But that was silly, wasn't it? It was just a painting, after all. He needed to pull himself together for his daughter, sell the painting, and use the money to buy her clothes and take better care of her. Because that's what his wife would have truly wanted. Plus, Abello wanted to thank the girl and her brother, Antonio, for helping him get back on his feet. She had a hard time accepting those words, knowing that even if she hadn't come today, he would have met someone else at the market and come to his senses. She told the painter that his painting would surely be recognized as a work of art. Although Abello didn't understand why she was so sure, the girl replied that it was a masterpiece in itself and people would see its value. The heroine knew very well that in the story, this artist would receive royal patronage and go on to create masterpieces. After getting the painting, Rosalia returned to the market, planning her next move. Lost in thought, she wasn't looking where she was going and bumped right into someone's back. The girl fell flat on her face and apologized to the stranger without even looking up. Just as the man turned to ask if she was all right, she looked up and was horrified to see it was the Duke. She hid behind the painting, desperately trying to figure out what to do now. The Duke didn't understand why she was covering her face and asked again if she was hurt. But she said nothing, still hiding behind the painting, and took off running. Alejandro wondered why the girl had run off so quickly and asked the Duke if he knew her. Klaus smiled and said that couldn't be, but her eyes were indeed very familiar. Back at the Baltazar estate, the girl carefully looked around, but calmed down when she saw everything was clear. She couldn't believe they had run into each other at the worst possible time, and while she was in that outfit. She approached the Duke's door, trying to see if he had returned. Just then, Klaus's voice came from behind her. He walked up, pushed the door open, and asked what Antonio wanted. Antonio tried to stay calm and replied that he didn't need anything. The Duke cut him off, saying that he had bad news then, because he had something to say to him. Klaus walked into his office and motioned for Antonio to follow him and talk. The Duke started by saying that Antonio had told him his sister, Rosalia de Hessen, was dead, but that he had met someone today who looked exactly like Antonio. The Duke leaned in close to Antonio, adding that the woman he met today had the exact same scent on her. Antonio pretended to have no idea what Mr. de Baltazar was talking about, but the Duke continued to press, demanding to know if Rosalia was really dead. Because if Antonio had lied and hidden his sister away, he would be in big trouble for it. It was only now that the heroine realized the Duke had never found out she was that girl. The guy had always been a cold and heartless bastard. He had used Rosalia, who loved him unconditionally, and then thrown her away like trash. In the end, that girl had met a very miserable end. Antonio gathered his courage and declared that the Duke was spouting nonsense. Besides the fact that he shouldn't say such things to a grieving brother, he and Rosalia weren't even blood related. When they were children, Rosalia's mother had married his father, the Baron, and brought her daughter with her. Since they weren't related by blood, it was impossible for them to look alike. The Duke conceded that he might have been mistaken and turned to dismiss Antonio. But before he reached the door, Klaus decided to add one last jab. He said that if this was all just an act, then he could only applaud Antonio for it. De Hessen shot him a quick glance and walked out of the office in silence. Alone, Klaus chided himself for acting so recklessly, blaming the strange scent for clouding his judgment. Back in her room, the heroine was thrilled that she had handled everything perfectly. She had gotten the painting she wanted, and now all that was left was to sell it and make some money. Now she needed to figure out how to do that, but she had no idea how to get the crown princess to see the painting. Cosette noticed that Antonio seemed to be troubled by something and offered to listen, promising to help in any way she could. She told him that he needed to shine brighter than anyone tonight and couldn't be so worried. Antonio smiled at her insistence, and the girl started to get angry, thinking he was underestimating her abilities. So de Hessen admitted that this was a tricky matter even for Cosette, because to pay off those debts, he had to meet Her Highness, the Crown Princess, first. Hearing this, Lady Baltazar said that was nothing special. She smiled and asked Antonio if he knew where today's tea party was being held. De Hessen looked out the window and was surprised to see they were heading toward the Crown Princess's family residence. During the tea party, Antonio won the admiration of the invited noble ladies. He did a stunning hairstyle for Rosalia de Hessen, the Crown Princess's sister from the Marquis Hessen family. Everyone was praising Antonio's talent and his incredibly handsome face. Cosette proudly confirmed that he was definitely one of those rare handsome men. But Lady Josette de Belmont from the Marquis family just snorted in annoyance. In her opinion, someone so frail couldn't possibly be a real servant, as he might break at the slightest touch. Cosette was instantly furious and was ready for a fight, but Antonio assured the lady that everything was fine. He approached Lady Josette, introduced himself very politely, and asked if he could do her hair. The moment he finished speaking, she blushed profusely. Our heroine knew exactly how to handle such people, as arrogant individuals like her were usually most susceptible to a gentle approach. Antonio insisted that an updo would better accentuate the lady's features. The girls at the table were stunned, not expecting this guy to calm Josette down so easily. Cosette immediately chimed in, saying Antonio had many more talents, such as a sharp eye for aesthetics. She said he was very fond of painting, with an artistic sense so keen that even the Duke acknowledged it. Cosette asked Lady Hurden if her sister was also interested in painting. Icalia confirmed this, adding that the Crown Princess had recently invited a group of artists to the palace, but she still hadn't found a painting she truly liked. Cosette seized the opportunity, mentioning that Antonio had recently acquired a painting the Crown Princess might like. Icalia promised to tell her sister, just hoping, that a piece would finally catch her eye. Cosette glanced back at Antonio and suddenly gave a signal, indicating their plan was a success. A few days later, our heroine entered the Imperial Palace, clutching a painting by a Bello Hampton under her arm. After living in this body for 3 years, she was finally going to meet the Crown Princess. She approached the door with a hint of unease, the door that led to the protagonist of this novel. I've lined up. Lugvizette greeted Antonio with a smile, and Antonio announced he had something to show her. The young man was nearly blinded by the Crown Princess's beauty. The joy of meeting the novel's heroine overwhelmed him. He bowed and declared it a great honor. Evelyn told Antonio to raise his head, as Cosette was like a dear sister to her. She had heard so much praise for the painting and had been eager to see it for herself. Antonio unwrapped the painting and placed it on an easel. The Crown Princess stared at it for a long time. Evelyn's silence stretched on for so long that it began to make her nervous. But then the Crown Princess turned around, smiled, and said the painting was indeed very good. She said she could almost feel the emotions of the woman in the painting. Antonio was thrilled to see Her Highness like the painting. He told her the painter's name was Abel O'Handam. Evelyn thanked de Hessen for showing her this incredible work of art. Then she told Antonio that she wanted to make him a proposal. As is well known, crown princesses cannot go wherever they please. And although she loved painting, it was difficult to find truly good works since she couldn't leave the palace. So she asked Antonio for a favor, trusting his keen artistic eye and promising to pay a fair price for it. Evelyn hoped de Hessen would continue to find and present such masterpieces to her, and he readily agreed. But first, the Crown Princess needed to set a price for the painting. When Her Highness's lady-in-waiting brought a check on a tray, our heroine grew excited. She knew that in the original story, Evelyn had paid 500 baron for this painting. However, upon seeing the check, Antonio cried out in surprise, wondering if the Crown Princess had made a mistake with the amount, as it read 1,000 baron. Evelyn explained that the amount included not only the price of the painting, but also some extra funds for his activities, as she hoped de Hessen would continue to bring her works of art. Our heroine was over the moon, because hey, maybe she could pay off that debt sooner than she thought. Just then, the Crown Princess was informed that His Highness the Crown Prince had arrived. Antonio bowed respectfully, and he couldn't help but notice how nervous Evelyn became. At this moment, the man with shining blonde hair and sun-like golden eyes exuded a hostile aura. He was Esteban Vandelope de Luge-Valset, the unhinged male lead of the novel, who constantly tormented the Crown Princess and only began to regret it near the end, and started to change. With fear in her eyes, Evelyn explained that she had invited Antonio over to inquire about Cosette's condition. Esteban wanted to know what the Crown Princess was plotting this time, as it was strange for her to invite the Duke's servant just to ask about a noble lady's health. He suspected she was secretly communicating with the ducal family. Klaus de Baltazar and Evelyn had been friends since childhood. The two were once inseparable, as close as could be. But after the Crown Prince came between them, everything changed to the point where they even hated each other. Esteban crossed his arms and sneered, wondering what Evelyn was up to, contacting the duchy behind his back. He didn't believe the Crown Princess's excuse of just wanting to know how Cosette was doing. Evelyn demanded he speak plainly and state what exactly he suspected her of. The Crown Prince believed her maternal family and the Duke's family might be plotting against him. Esteban said Evelyn looked like she was hiding something, but she told him to stop. The Crown Prince grabbed his bride's hand and asked what she would do if he didn't. Because if she intended for him to die an early death like his mother, that would be too bad. He wasn't that fragile. In the original novel, this kind of thing happened often, All the suspicions and misunderstandings kept piling up, eventually leading to a huge disaster. All they needed was for Klaus to show up out of nowhere and make everything worse. And what do you know, just as she thought that, the Duke actually walked into the room. He freed Evelyn's hand from Esteban's grasp and calmly told His Highness to stop. She couldn't believe this was all happening right before her eyes. The Crown Prince remarked that Duke de Baltazar had arrived just in time. He sneered, pointing out that compared to those two, he was the one who looked like the bad guy. After that, he and Klaus started arguing until Evelyn yelled enough at them, or else she would threaten to be absent from the next diplomatic banquet. Now that the Crown Princess had issued an ultimatum, Esteban decided to slip away. It would be a real shame if Evelyn, with her sharp intuition, missed such an important event. But before leaving, he left a threat, saying that if the Duke dared to get in his way again, his entire family would pay the price. After Esteban left, Klaus asked Evelyn why she always let the Crown Prince treat her so horribly. She retorted furiously that it was none of his business. Just then, the Duke noticed Antonio had been standing there the whole time. He turned to his servant and asked what he was doing here. It seemed the Crown Princess clearly wanted to hide the fact that she was going to collect paintings with Antonio, answering for him that she had called a servant to check the facilities. The Duke wondered if Antonio planned to stand there until he was told he could leave. As soon as she stepped out of the room, she thought, "No way, does Klaus think I wanted to stand there on my own?" That's right. Just as Antonio walked out of the palace, the Crown Prince called out to him from around the corner. The servant pretended not to hear anything, but Esteban pursued him. Antonio turned around, pretending to have just noticed the Crown Prince, and asked what he wanted with a humble servant like himself. Esteban looked around to make sure no one was watching, then grabbed the guy by the collar. The Crown Prince dragged the servant into the garden where no one could overhear them. Esteban pinned him against a wall and asked what orders he had received from the Duke, whether to spy or merely observe. He promised to let Antonio go if he answered truthfully, but the guy claimed he hadn't received any orders. The Crown Prince kept pressing, promising to pay double or even triple what the Duke was offering. She had to admit the offer to betray Klaus and make a fortune was quite tempting, but Antonio stood his ground, saying he was just here to work, and that was all. After a pause, Esteban suddenly grabbed the servant's wrist, surprised by how slender it was. He found it strange that Antonio was so short and thin. He asked for the servant's name. Memories of the original story flooded the heroine's mind. Back then, after the Crown Prince discovered the name of the Duke's little lapdog, Rosalia, he ordered the guards to take care of her. They seized her and dragged her to the guillotine. All her pleas for Klaus to save her were useless. As Antonio remained silent, lost in thought, the Crown Prince began to lose his patience. In the original story, it was this man who caused Rosalia's, The girl was caught eavesdropping on a crucial conversation on the Duke's orders and was eventually sent to the guillotine. The servant finally snapped out of it and told Esteban his name. The prince felt the name didn't quite suit him and asked why he was so frail. Antonio explained that he had never had enough to eat since he was a child. As for his short stature, he didn't like to talk about it. It was his biggest insecurity. The Crown Prince finally let Antonio go. Back in the Balthazar Duchy, the servant walked into Klaus's study and handed him an envelope containing double the promised amount. Antonio was curious what the Duke would say, as he hadn't believed he would return the money. Klaus took the envelope, but wanted to know what de Hessen had been doing in the Crown Princess's palace. He didn't believe it was Closette who sent Antonio, and demanded the truth. The Duke forbade using the Crown Princess in any way for personal gain. But Antonio retorted that how he paid off his debt was his own business and told Klaus to stay out of it. The Duke leaped to his feet, grabbed the servant's coat, and exploded, demanding how he dared to speak of the Crown Princess that way. Antonio calmly stated that he had no intention of harming Evelyn, and Klaus shouldn't twist the facts, as it would put him in a difficult position. Once he paid off his debt, he would disappear. If that was all the Duke had to say, he wished to be let go. Although she appeared perfectly calm on the outside, she was seething with rage inside. After all, the Duke himself had used and abandoned Rosalia, not even defending the person who took the fall for him. When Klaus is framed as a traitor and they're about to execute him, she will definitely not lift a finger to help. Instead, she will flash a brilliant smile, thrilled that he is finally getting his just deserts. And this time, it will be his turn to pay the ultimate price for his obsession with the Crown Princess. After leaving the Duke, Antonio went to a shop with Cosette, who was picking out a new mask. She noticed that Hessen was preoccupied and joked that he looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Hearing this sharp yet somewhat funny remark, Antonio managed a small smile. Cosette was very perceptive. She immediately guessed that Klaus was the reason for his bad mood. After hearing what happened, she told Antonio to ignore it, because the Duke became even more unbearable whenever the crown princess was involved. Her opinion was that he just needed to focus on finishing the job he was contracted to do. Cosette handed Antonio a mask and told him to try it on. He said the mask wasn't his style. So, Lady de Baltazar decided to create a style that suited him. Cosette had always been curious about what Antonio would look like in women's clothing. She insisted that after all she had done for him, he could at least indulge her this one time. Standing in the dressing room, wearing a wig and a dress, she wondered how things had come to this. When she walked into the main hall, Cosette and Melda were completely stunned by the sight. Cosette felt Antonio was born to be a girl, as he looked unbelievably beautiful. She was ready to hire a painter to do his portrait. Her only regret was that she could only find a blonde wig, as Lady de Baltazar thought dark hair would suit him better. Cosette handed Antonio a pile of masks and told him to try them all on. Her birthday masquerade ball was coming up soon, and she had already sent an invitation to Her Highness the Crown Princess. Now Cosette wanted Antonio to attend the party as well, but as an invited guest, not just a subordinate. Although de Hessen thought it wasn't a good idea, she insisted that no one would recognize him with a mask on. A few days later, the issue of what Antonio would wear to the masquerade ball came up again. Cosette absolutely forbade him from showing up in his usual work coat. Antonio was surrounded by a group of maids taking his measurements. Watching this scene, Cosette let out a strange laugh, leaving de Hessen completely puzzled. Alejandro came in and handed Lady de Baltazar a gift from the Duke. Lounging on the sofa, Cosette opened the box and took out a diamond pendant. As she tossed the box aside, Antonio asked why Klaus sent the gift early. Cosette said her brother claimed he would be too busy to come. As usual, he didn't even care that this party was not only for her birthday, but also her social debut. That cold-blooded animal never cared about family matters, only work and money. Klaus had never attended Cosette's birthday parties, let alone the anniversaries of their parents' deaths. In his office, the Duke was trying to focus on work, but Antonio's words still echoed in his mind. The guy had told him not to make a big deal out of everything. A knock on the door pulled Klaus from his thoughts. Antonio entered the office, looking somewhat hesitant. A strange, awkward atmosphere hung between them since what had happened here a few days ago. De Hessen finally mustered the courage to say he was there on behalf of the young lady, who had asked him to express her gratitude for the gift. After he finished, a strange silence filled the air. Sensing the tension, the Duke asked if Antonio had anything else to say. The guy brought out a box from behind his back, saying he'd rather give him something. Klaus opened the box to find a mask inside, but he didn't know what it was for. Antonio explained that, though he might not know it, the young lady's birthday party was going to be a masquerade ball. Klaus said he was well aware, as it was the biggest financial expense for the duchy this year. Under the Duke's sharp gaze, Antonio felt very awkward, but he finally gathered the courage to state the purpose of his visit. He asked if His Grace would be attending the event, as it wasn't about money, but about his sister's birthday and social debut. In response, Klaus pointed to a pile of documents on Antonio's desk, saying he was swamped and couldn't just drop everything and change his schedule for some party. Cosette should understand why he works day and night. But Antonio still tried to convince the Duke that it was more than just a party or a birthday. A debut ball is an event every noble looks forward to, where they build connections and relationships. A social debut is a big deal for a girl, and even if the young lady didn't say it, Antonio was sure she was very upset. Klaus argued that someone who had only been in his estate for about a month was in no position to judge the situation. They had always lived this way, each doing their own thing. The Duke was convinced he had fulfilled all his duties and given his sister the best of everything. Seeing that the guy just didn't get it, Antonio accused him of being neglectful. Of course, Cosette cared, because after their parents' death, Klaus was all she truly had left. Hearing this, the Duke's face immediately darkened, and he said Antonio was incredibly annoying and ordered him to get out. The servant apologized for wasting so much of Lord de Balthazar's precious time, then bowed and exited. Alone, Klaus rubbed his temples wearily, then glanced at the mask on his desk. The next day, Alejandro reported to the Duke on the reopened investigation into the de Hessen family case. He handed the documents to Klaus, suggesting he see for himself. The Baron's daughter's death certificate was forged, which came as no surprise to the Duke. It was imperative to find out what Antonio was hiding from him. On the day of the masquerade ball, Cosette, accompanied by Antonio, was accepting blessings from the guests. One of the ladies was praising how wonderful and well-organized the party was. As always, Lady Josette de Belmont came forward at this moment, echoing the sentiments and congratulating the birthday girl. She introduced Cosette to her older brother, who warmly welcomed and congratulated the lady, saying he had heard all about her from his sister. After that, the young Marquis started shaking hands with Antonio, completely mistaking him for Duke de Baltazar. He said he had long been eager to meet the Duke in person, and that it was the only reason he came. The Marquis kept fawning over de Hessen until Cosette finally corrected him, saying he was not the Duke. She took Antonio's arm and introduced him to the guests as her partner for the ball. The Marquis was very embarrassed, as he was sure Cosette's partner would be her brother. He wanted to know when the Duke himself would appear, but Josette cut in, scolding her brother for asking such a question. According to her, everyone knew His Grace the Duke was too busy to attend parties. Josette said Cosette must find this very offensive, and her brother began to apologize. Looking around and noticing the guests whispering, our heroine realized these two were just trying to provoke Cosette. She stood in the middle of the hall with her head down, listening to everyone gossip about her and her brother's relationship. Just as the heroine's heart ached to see the young lady so upset, they announced the arrival of Duke de Baltazar. Klaus descended the stairs wearing the mask Antonio had given him. He walked up to his sister, apologized for being late, and wished her a happy 15th birthday. Cosette took her brother's arm and replied that Klaus had arrived just in time, as the Belmont heirs were dying to know where he was. She quickly introduced the Duke to the young ladies and Mr. Belmont, and the Marquis immediately headed toward them. He started fawning over Mr. de Baltazar all over again. She was surprised that Klaus actually showed up at the masquerade, not expecting him to come at all. It seemed their conversation had moved the Duke after all. My words must have struck a chord with him. Klaus turned as if to say something to Antonio, but the young Marquis still wouldn't leave him alone. De Hessen smiled and slipped away, leaving the group chatting in the middle of the hall. Josette watched him go, looking like she was plotting something in her head. Her gaze was locked on Cosette, practically screaming at her how wrong she was. Lady Belmont refused to be seen as the loser here. She picked up a glass of wine and approached Antonio, toasting to his health. Josette was determined to take away what Cosette de Baltazar held most dear. She downed her drink and then tucked a handkerchief into her dress. Josette said she was very lucky as she had no one to talk to. She suggested that Antonio go somewhere quiet to talk. De Hessen glanced back at Josette's brother, who was still following behind. Although he had no desire to go anywhere with this girl, he decided to eliminate anything that might disturb Cosette, as she seemed genuinely happy for once. He took Josette's arm and, as she requested, led her to a more secluded spot. After sitting down on a sofa in one of the drawing rooms, Lady Belmont invited Antonio to sit next to her. Although the guy doubted if he was allowed, Josette reminded him that today he was a guest, not a servant. Antonio sat on the sofa, warning that he couldn't stay away for too long, as he was Lady Cosette's partner. But Josette said that a minute would be enough. Meanwhile, Cosette was frantically searching the room for Antonio, who had been there just a minute ago. The Duke told his sister he saw him leave with the daughter of Marquis Belmont. He didn't understand why Cosette was so surprised. It was permissible for those two to have a private chat. Back by the sofa, Josette was pouring Antonio another drink, telling him she really liked him. She said she'd been infatuated with him ever since he did her hair at the tea party. Just as our heroine was freaking out about what to do, Josette leaned in close and asked Antonio how he felt about her. Then, as if by accident, she spilled wine on his shirt, pulled out her handkerchief, and asked if she could help him clean it. De Hessen backed away, saying he needed to leave, but suddenly felt dizzy. Josette seized the opportunity, push him down onto the sofa, and climbed on top of him. Antonio realized the girl had drugged his drink. He couldn't even move. Josette sneered, saying she had always hated that self-righteous Cosette girl. Belmont complained that she always got the best of everything. Josette was delighted, openly imagining Cosette's reaction when she found out she had stolen her partner and made him her own. She started to undress Antonio, who trembled at the thought of her discovering he was a girl. But before Josette could get the shirt off, Cosette burst into the room. She gritted her teeth, glaring furiously at Lady Belmont, while Antonio desperately tried to call for help. Josette yelled at Cosette to get out and mind her own business. But the next moment, Miss Balthazar lunged at her, landing a heavy punch to her stomach and knocking her to the floor. The heroine watched in admiration at what was unfolding, unable to take her eyes off her beautiful savior. But as Cosette leaned in close to Antonio, he lost consciousness. A while later, he woke up in bed, holding his head and trying to recall what had happened. Cosette and Melda were sitting beside him. When Antonio finally remembered everything, Miss Balthazar revealed that she had given Josette a sound beating and then kicked her out. After saying this, Cosette fell silent again, staring intently at de Hessen. Our protagonist finally realized that both ladies were staring at her body, as she was only wearing a nightgown. Since Antonio's clothes were dirty, Cosette and the maid had decided to change him. When they took off his shirt, the secret was out, and they discovered a girl before them. Rosalia hadn't expected to be exposed like this, and she begged them to let her explain everything. However, for some reason, she felt that the two ladies didn't seem surprised at all. Despite this, Cosette claimed she wasn't just surprised, but completely shocked. But she didn't care at all whether she was a man or a woman, because that didn't change who they were. Cosette dropped a bombshell, admitting she had been fantasizing about how great it would be if Antonio were a girl. Rosalia thanked Miss Balthazar, but apologized for the deception and pleaded for a chance to explain everything. Cosette, knowing her brother was the cause of all this, promised to keep the secret, and Melda agreed, believing the girl had a good reason. The maid admitted she had been a little suspicious, as Antonio was too gentle for a man. Cosette was thrilled that Rosalia was a girl, as she had actually already prepared a dress for her, just as she had wished. Meanwhile, the Duke was still stuck with the clingy Marquis, scratching his head and wondering where Cosette had run off to. It had been a long time since she went to find Antonio, but she hadn't returned. Suddenly, Klaus spotted his sister dragging a girl into the hall. Rosalia tried to tell Cosette this was wrong, but she wouldn't back down, saying there was nothing to worry about and everything would be fine. She bet that Josette was lurking somewhere waiting for Antonio, like a hungry wolf ready to pounce. Rosalia reminded Cosette that she had been too harsh on Lady Belmont. Miss Balthazar got angry, threatening not to help her next time. Then she started playing the victim, pointing out that leaving her own birthday party in the middle of the night was really not very nice. Cosette sobbed dramatically and turned away from Rosalia, complaining that apparently she was the only one who thought they were friends. Rosalia smiled, pointing out that for some reason she didn't see any tears. Just then, they announced the arrival of Crown Prince Esteban and Crown Princess Evelyn de Louvelzette. Cosette went to the Duke, who asked where she had been and where Antonio was. The girl replied that he was feeling unwell and had returned to his quarters. Klaus turned and looked at the girl who was stubbornly hiding behind a pillar in the hall. Evelyn interrupted the siblings' conversation, approaching tonight's birthday girl to congratulate her. To everyone present, let us welcome the little son of the Empire, His Highness the Crown Prince, and Her Highness the Crown Princess. Chloe thanked them for taking the time out of their busy schedules to attend her banquet. Iva Leon said that they could never miss the birthday of the esteemed Miss Balthazar. While the ladies were chatting, the Duke and the Crown Prince turned their gazes in the same direction. Esteban suddenly spotted Rosalia, who was trying to slip away quietly. He blocked her path, pleased to have finally run into her. Rosalia curtsied and greeted His Highness the Crown Prince, but he told her not to be so formal, as this was not their first meeting. She didn't know what he was talking about and tried to leave, but Esteban suddenly grabbed her hand, pulled her close to dance, and told her to stand still and play along with him. Rosalia didn't understand why he wanted to dance with her when the Crown Princess was right there, but he told her to shut up and just dance. She glared at Esteban, cursing him for being a despicable man who was using her to embarrass the Crown Princess. The Crown Prince winked and said she was quite sharp. Eveline felt utterly humiliated as she stood there, hearing the guests gossip behind her back about how the Crown Prince had started dancing with a nobody. Klaus just silently watched the Crown Princess's trembling hands. Meanwhile, Esteban told Rosalia that he was no fool either. When she asked what he meant, the Crown Prince replied that her wrists were unusually slender. He smirked, thinking to himself that Duke Balthazar didn't seem to have discovered that his servant was actually a girl. Esteban didn't know why she was doing it, but he promised to keep her secret if she did him a favor. Before she could ask how she could help him, the Crown Prince dipped her and leaned in close. Rosalia realized that from any other angle, the move would look like they were kissing. As the dance ended, Esteban whispered a reminder for her not to forget this favor. The heroine was terrified, knowing she would definitely regret this later. The Duke was walking towards them, and from his expression, it was clear he had something to say. Esteban shielded her with his back and told Klaus that approaching with such a murderous glare would scare the girl to death, unless he was trying to ask him for a dance. The Duke gritted his teeth and told him to move. He said with utmost sarcasm that Klaus clearly wanted to dance with a lady and suggested he fix his attitude. As they argued, the heroine saw her chance and tried to slip away. The Duke spotted her and sharply ordered her to stop, but Rosalia lifted her skirt and ran, not even thinking of stopping. Before she knew it, she had run outside and was hiding behind the bushes under a window. The girl held her head, completely at a loss, wondering what on earth she was supposed to do now. Just then, the Duke approached her, calling her by the name Rosalia de Hessen, and saying she had a real talent for running away. Klaus was trying to recall how many times she had pulled this trick, including this one, but she claimed he had the wrong person. But the Duke had double-checked and found that the news of Rosalia de Hessen's death was completely fabricated. He blamed the damn officials for not doing their job properly as he walked towards the terrified girl who was covering her face. He crouched in front of her, declaring that he was now completely certain Antonio had lied to him. When he asked if she had been in contact with her brother all this time, Rosalia begged him not to be too hard on Antonio, as everything he did was for her sake. Since the siblings had both played him for a fool, Klaus proposed that she and her brother work together at the duchy to pay off the Baron's debt. The heroine was terrified at the thought of having to play two different identities at once. Klaus thought it was unfair for Antonio to pay off the entire family debt alone. Since there was no way out, she decided to be bolder. She admitted she regretted deceiving him, but what was done, because she was already helping her brother. If the Duke thought she would run away, then next time, she would bring the money to him herself. Looking at the girl, Klaus couldn't shake the feeling that they looked too similar to be unrelated. He took a closer look at her, but his attention was diverted by Closette's voice as she also ran into the courtyard. Closette rushed to Rosalia, who tearfully threw herself at Miss Balthazar. Now Klaus understood how the girl had gotten into the banquet. He turned to his sister and asked if she knew about all of this. Closette didn't want to hear her brother accuse her of hiding this from him. The Hessens were just trying to pay off their debt, and there was nothing wrong with that. Noticing that the young Marchioness had also entered the courtyard, looking for the mysterious stranger, the Duke decided it was time to leave. After returning to the manor, he told Rosalia not to forget about next time. Closette was frustrated that things had turned out this way, but the heroine said, "Relax, we're fine, we didn't get caught." Miss Balthazar was confused how the Duke could be so sharp about everything else, yet be a complete idiot when it came to this. Not wanting to stay any longer, Closette suggested that Rosalia return to the party. Rosalia agreed. On the way, she asked Closette how she knew the Crown Prince. Then she told her to lower her voice, as Klaus was the type to eavesdrop everywhere. The next day, our heroine, disguised as Antonio, was in a tavern, wondering why she had to open her big mouth. Now she had to hurry and find the next painting to get the money for the Duke. A waitress walked up to the table and handed Antonio a menu. Our heroine noticed the woman's hands were stained with paint and realized she had found the person she was looking for. The second painting in the Crown Princess's collection was by Nadia Erlos, a painter who would later become famous. Antonio smiled and ordered a beer, but no food. Then he asked for the woman's name, explaining that he was just curious and wanted to give some advice to such a kind lady. Although the artist didn't introduce herself, the owner, who peeked out from behind the counter, called out Nadia's name. Antonio smiled, confirming that this was the person he had been looking for. But before he could say a word, the woman's expression suddenly changed as if she were utterly terrified. In an instant, she turned and ran, leaving not only the customer but also the bar owner baffled. The heroine returned to the duchy, extremely frustrated by the fruitless trip. Lost in thought, she didn't notice the Duke approaching from behind her. When Klaus spoke to Antonio, he was startled by the sudden appearance. The Duke didn't find it strange that de Hessen was startled. He figured he was obviously feeling guilty about something. Antonio, on the other hand, didn't feel there was any reason to be guilty, as he was working his butt off to pay back the debt. Klaus wondered if this guy wanted to explain why his supposedly dead sister was not only alive and well, but had also appeared at the banquet last night. He was furious that Antonio had dared to lie to him like that. The look Klaus was giving the guy now could have burned anyone to a crisp. But Antonio composed himself and replied that he had no choice, as he didn't know what kind of person His Grace the Duke was. But now that he knew how generous and righteous the Duke was, he was willing to accept punishment if necessary, although he had his reasons. Klaus cut off Antonio's rambling, but then suddenly fell silent. De Hessen couldn't figure out what he was trying to say with that hesitant tone, when suddenly the Duke thanked him for what he had just said. Antonio was stunned by the unexpected behavior from the man who was always so stern and cold. At the reception, Cosette had called Klaus brother, and he suddenly realized he had forgotten the last time she had called him that. The Duke admitted that this was all because of Antonio. Klaus thanked him for helping Cosette prepare for her social debut and for making him realize how important it was to her. Back to being a blonde, the heroine walked through the market, pondering what kind of person the Duke really was. After thanking Antonio, he had promised to pretend he hadn't messed up this time. Rosalia hadn't expected that from him at all, and her heart clenched at the thought. Suddenly, on the street, the heroine saw Nadia trying to explain to the tavern owner that she had run into big trouble yesterday. The woman begged him to forgive her just this once, as she really needed the job. But the owner didn't want to rehire an employee who had left without a word in the middle of her shift. He rudely shooed Nadia out and slammed the door, right in her face. No matter how the woman knocked, the owner wouldn't open the door for her again. It was then that Nadia noticed a girl had been watching the whole thing. The woman snapped at the stranger, asking what she was looking at and if she was enjoying the show. Before Rosalia could answer, Nadia turned and walked away. Sensing the stranger was following her, the woman stopped abruptly. She told her to mind her own business and go away, as what had just happened was none of her concern. Rosalia caught up, saying she couldn't just ignore what happened and wanted to know if she was okay. Suddenly, Nadia stopped so short that the girl bumped right in her back. She looked up and gasped in shock, for she saw two thugs standing in the middle of the path. They mocked Nadia, saying she was foolish to think she would be safe here. The guy started walking towards the girls, a knife glinting in his hand. Rosalia wanted Nadia to tell her what these guys wanted from her, but she remained silent. Just then, another thug came up from behind them with a weaselly grin, pointing out that the lady wasn't alone. Nadia pushed the guy away from Rosalia, claiming they weren't together and telling him to leave her out of it. The thugs didn't buy it, but the woman insisted she had just met the girl. But the robbers thought this was even better, because that way they could take the girl away without Nadia having to worry. The woman looked annoyed and started lecturing Rosalia on what happens when you follow strangers around. Our girl told herself to pull it together. Whether this was in the original novel or not, she just needed to survive right now. She had watched tons of self-defense tutorials on her phone, and they all said the first thing to do was to scream your lungs out to catch your opponent off guard. And that's exactly what Rosalia did, startling everyone around her. Just then, the Duke, who was in town on business with Alejandro, heard some kind of strange scream. But the assistant didn't hear anything, and since they had an appointment with the head of the merchant guild, he urged Klaus to hurry. The Duke followed Alejandro, but something made him stop again. Meanwhile, Rosalia continued to scream at the top of her lungs. One of the thugs ran at the girl, wanting to shut the crazy woman up. The heroine remembered all her self-defense moves, took a step back, shifted her weight onto one leg, raised her hands, and as soon as the guy got close, she pushed him away with all her might. After that, Rosalia grabbed Nadia's hand and fled the alley as fast as she could. But they didn't get far, because the guy with the scar on his face grabbed Nadia. Just then, the Duke appeared in the alley and kicked the thug away from the girls. After dealing with the criminal, Klaus admitted that he was amazed at how Rosalia always managed to get into these kinds of situations. Just as he was trying to figure out what kind of trouble the girl had gotten into this time, the other thug rushed him from behind. But the Duke reacted quickly and blocked the attack in time. Meanwhile, the heroine grabbed Nadia's hand and told her to follow. They hid behind some crates, But the woman was confused, not understanding why they were doing this since she thought that man was the girl's friend. In truth, Rosalia didn't know why she was running either. She was just acting on instinct. After seeing the heroine, Nadia suddenly started coughing violently, but she assured the girl she was fine. Then she got up and asked Rosalia to follow her, saying it seemed she was destined to be in her debt. After walking a few blocks, Nadia opened the door to a house and invited the girl inside. She said the place was shabby, but it was where she lived. Since Rosalia had helped her, Nadia wanted to repay her. The heroine tried to refuse, but the woman pushed her into a chair, saying she had to have some pride. Nadia slipped into another room, while Rosalia looked around her extremely humble abode. Suddenly, the woman returned, holding a painting she had done herself. Nadia said she didn't have much, and this was the only way she could repay the girl for her help. The heroine was stunned when she saw the artist holding another painting from the Crown Princess's collection. Nadia sighed heavily, saying this was her last painting. Rosalia wondered, did this woman know what was going to happen next? Because in the original story, the talented artist died of a terrible illness, never receiving the recognition she deserved. And that abstract painting was indeed her last work. Nadia started coughing again and admitted she was so broke she couldn't even afford paint anymore. When asked if she had seen a doctor, she said she couldn't afford it as she was drowning in debt and being chased by loan sharks. Nadia told her not to look at her with such pity, as she never thought she would live this long anyway. Rosalia asked why she didn't sell her paintings, and Nadia said she didn't paint them to be sold. It was her only escape, because for someone in her situation, once they got sick, all they could do was wait for death. But when Nadia painted, she could forget everything and escape her harsh reality. She had sold everything she owned, but she wasn't about to sell her peace of mind. Realizing she was pouring her heart out to a stranger, Nadia just told her to take the painting, though she didn't know what the girl would do with it. Rosalia thanked her for the wonderful gift, and Nadia just told her not to come back to this part of town unless she wanted to get into big trouble. But after taking the painting, Rosalia promised Nadia she would be back soon. To her surprise, she thought that if the artist could get recognition for her work now, maybe she could actually survive. So the next day, our girl, disguised as Antonio again, headed to the Crown Princess's palace. Upon meeting, Eveline admitted she was disappointed that de Hessen couldn't make it to Closette's birthday party. But she said she had the pleasure of meeting his sister, Miss Rosalia. Eveline figured that news of the Crown Prince showing some interest in his sister at the ball must have gotten back to Antonio. Hearing this, our girl started to tremble because what Esteban did to her could hardly be called interest. Before Antonio could answer, the Crown Princess asked him to arrange a meeting with Rosalia. She told him not to worry. She wasn't going to interrogate his sister, since she was to become the Empress of Lugvelzit. Taking care of and protecting the people of this country was her duty. But, she said, unfortunately, the Crown Prince had not yet fully grasped the gravity of his position, so he would continue to act as he did at the party. The heroine was shocked by the Crown Princess's insight, but Eveline continued, saying that as long as there were factions trying to shake the throne, Esteban's behavior would only give them more ammunition to attack the royal family. She couldn't just watch the entire dynasty crumble, so she wanted Miss Rosalia to become the Crown Prince's wife. Antonio couldn't hide his shock and surprise at all this. He tried to tell Eveline that Rosalia would refuse, as she wasn't very educated and was barely even a noble. Even so, the Crown Princess insisted that the girl would receive a proper education at the palace. Besides, there were plenty of historical examples of emperors marrying commoners. The heroine thought this was going too far, even for someone so dedicated to protecting the throne. She had always admired her strong sense of duty and unwavering determination, but sometimes she couldn't help but feel sorry for her. And so, Antonio asked if he could ask the Crown Princess a question. He wanted to know if what she had just said was her personal opinion, or if it was what she believed was the right thing to do because of her position. Eveline found it a very strange question, because she was the Crown Princess. She couldn't even imagine a version of herself who wasn't the Crown Princess, whether people saw her as a villain or the heir to the throne. After a short pause, Antonio replied that some called him the Duke's servant, others a fallen noble, but whatever title people gave him, it was just a label, and he didn't think it was the real him. In fact, The heroine reminded herself of this time and again, whether she was in the guise of Antonio or as Rosalia de Hessen. He concluded that no matter how people saw him, he would never forget who he was. He placed the painting on the easel, apologized for having to ask again, and asked how Evelyn felt if she were stripped of her role as crown princess. The girl pondered her true feelings. Looking at the painting, she confessed that she was disappointed in Esteban and felt a little lonely in the palace. Because of that, painting became Avelian's only solace. She never expected much from Esteban. She only wished he would respect her and see her as a partner and companion in building the empire together. And now, Evelyn somehow felt that the person who painted this picture felt the same way she did. It was breathtakingly beautiful, but behind it hid a quiet loneliness. Truly, these two completely different people were so similar. They had both given up and lost everything, even themselves. Antonio was glad that the painting, which depicted a vast, brilliant, and beautiful sky, pleased Her Highness. The work was titled Freedom, something that Nadia, the heroine herself, and perhaps even Crown Princess Evelyn longed for. She smiled and thanked Antonio. The next day, there was a knock on Nadia's door. Recognizing Rosalia, the artist opened the door and immediately reminded her that she had warned her not to come back. But when Nadia looked up, she was completely stunned and froze on the spot. Rosalia stood at the door, beaming from ear to ear, surrounded by a large group of people. Once inside, the girl began instructing the workers on how to repair the house. Then, another person approached Nadia and began asking how she was feeling and when she first started getting sick. The woman demanded that someone explain what on earth was going on. Rosalia said she was there on the direct orders of Her Highness, who was deeply moved by Nadia's work. The Crown Princess had decided to sponsor the artist so that she could continue to create. With that, Rosalia handed Nadia a gift, a box full of paints. She reminded the woman of her own words. That painting was the one thing she wanted to protect most, and now she wouldn't have to lose it. Nadia took the gift with trembling hands, held it close, and thanked Rosalia as tears began to stream down her cheeks. Later, over tea, the artist asked the girl to visit more often, saying she was a bit lonely. Rosalia promised to visit Nadia often, and in return, she asked Nadia to make sure she took her medicine on time. At noon, our girl arrived at the Baltazar Duchy. Disguised as Rosalia, she wasn't sure what had possessed her to promise that she, not Antonio, would deliver the money next time. She knocked on the door to Klaus's office. Upon entering the room, Rosalia nervously greeted the Duke. Klaus was surprised to see her in the same dress again, but she explained that she needed to save every penny to pay off her debt. The Duke crossed his arms haughtily and pointed out that she had run away again that day. As usual, Rosalia insisted that she was very grateful, but her friend had been feeling unwell, and they had to leave in a hurry. Klaus leaned in close, his expression serious, and demanded she explain what the hell she was up to, suddenly appearing at a ball and then being chased by thugs. He didn't understand why Rosalia was so stubborn about not joining the duchy. But no matter how much he asked, the heroine wouldn't budge. So she told him again that she felt more comfortable this way. The Duke wondered how long Rosalia planned to keep suffering, but she didn't understand why he was so worked up about it. She insisted she could handle things and that it was fine. Hearing this, Klaus slammed his hand on the desk, saying she and her brother had a real talent for getting on his nerves. He just wished Rosalia would stop being so damn stubborn. He leaned in close to her again and caught that sweet, intoxicating scent. Klaus wondered if such a perfume really existed. The heroine pointed to the envelope with a promised debt payment, thanked him again for his help last time, but said that he had no right to dictate her life. Rosalia pleaded with the Duke not to misunderstand. What she owed him was money. The scent wafting from the girl was driving Klaus crazy, and he asked if she was going to cling to her pride until the very end. Anyone who heard that would think he was actually pursuing her, and she was just playing hard to get to satisfy her vanity. The Duke wondered how much he would have to offer for her to agree, but before he could finish, she slapped him. Her face was filled with anger and resentment, and tears began to well up in her eyes. She declared that from now on, she would pay the rest of the debt through Antonio, and hoped they wouldn't have to meet for such unpleasant matters again. Rosalia walked straight to the door. Left alone, Klaus suddenly realized what a foolish idiot he had been. The slap had actually sobered him up, and he couldn't believe the garbage he had just spouted. The Duke couldn't understand why he completely lost his reason whenever that pair of siblings was involved. Cosette burst into Antonio's room cheerfully, asking if he wanted to hang out, but de Hessen didn't even look up, so she immediately asked what was wrong. Cosette had the heroine sit at the table and brought out some cookies she had received as a gift to share. But for some reason, all Rosalia could think about was that jerk, and the more she thought about what he said, the angrier she got. Unable to control her emotions any longer, she crushed the cookie in her hand, and it crumbled into pieces. Seeing this, Cosette got angry and scolded Rosalia for taking her anger out on the innocent cookie. Since she didn't like seeing her friends so upset, she suggested they go for a picnic by the lake. Although Rosalia wasn't in the mood, Cosette thought that was all the more reason some fresh air would do her good. Meanwhile, the Duke was working, but he was so distracted that Alejandro had to repeat everything several times. The assistant asked what his Grace was so distracted by, at which point he confessed that there was a woman who was driving him crazy. Alejandro was overjoyed at the thought that the Duke had finally found someone he liked, and he wanted to know her name so he could arrange a meeting as soon as possible. But his assistant was confused when Klaus said it wasn't like that at all. If it wasn't, then why was he thinking about her? The only other reason he could think of for the Duke to be thinking about a woman was if she had run off with his money. Considering his Grace needed a break anyway, Alejandro promised to take care of everything else and suggested he go out for some air. As Klaus walked, he thought about how ridiculous the idea of him liking the woman was. He was convinced it was all because of that strange and captivating scent. Turning a corner, the Duke spotted Cosette and Antonio. They were drifting by in a small boat. Meanwhile, Cosette kept pestering Antonio, asking if he was sure there was nothing to worry about, since it wasn't important enough to bother Miss Baltazar with. De Hessen said he was fine. Just then, a strong gust of wind blew the hat off Cosette's head. She said she could just buy another one, but Antonio leaned over to grab the hat from the water. Cosette tried to stop him, but his mind was so preoccupied with the Duke that he didn't hear her. Before Miss Baltazar could react, Antonio had already plunged headfirst into the water. Her mind raced as she couldn't swim, and the fear of death was hitting her hard. Rosalia couldn't believe that after everything, this was how it would end, and she prayed for a miracle. With a splash, Klaus, like a beacon of hope in the dark depths, reached out and pulled Antonio to safety. After dragging de Hessen out of the water, the Duke yelled at him to hang on. When the guy finally coughed up water and opened his eyes, Klaus was confused. What on earth was he thinking, jumping into the lake like that? Her tears streamed down as she had just had a brush with death. So when the Duke questioned if Antonio could stay out of trouble for 1 second, Antonio just stared at him, thinking about how he lived on the line between life and death every day. Everything that was happening now was no longer just a discussion on paper. This was real life. Tears welled up in Antonio's eyes as he confessed to the Duke that he truly thought he was going to die. It was as if he was saying, is it really necessary to be so harsh to someone who just had a near-death experience? Just then, Chloe, who had just docked the boat, ran towards them. She rushed over to check if Antonio was okay or if he was even still breathing. Chloe was terrified and told him never to do something so foolish as jumping into the water just to get a hat again. Antonio promised her he wouldn't and said he was very sorry. He looked up and met the Duke's strange gaze. Klaus had already turned to leave, and Antonio thanked him for saving his life. But Klaus didn't look back, simply telling the guy to watch himself. Chloe couldn't understand how he could be so heartless and cold-blooded when someone had nearly died right in front of him. When the Duke returned to the manor, Alejandro was surprised, not understanding why he looked as if he had just walked out of a downpour. But Klaus didn't answer, just walked straight past, completely lost in his own thoughts. The image of the near-dead Antonio wouldn't leave his mind, and the Duke was trying to figure out what this strange feeling inside him was. Antonio went to visit the crown princess and told her that although Nadia had refused payment for the painting, she had accepted the sponsorship. Hearing this news, Abelohan was now also actively working on his piece. Eveline praised Antonio for a job well done. Antonio, in turn, said he only did what he was supposed to do. Eveline wanted to ask Antonio something and told him that a delegation from the Refilio's empire was about to arrive. Hearing this, our little girl realized it was time for the second male lead from the novel to make his appearance. The crown princess said that as soon as the envoys arrived, a welcome banquet would be held for them. Eveline wanted Antonio to attend as a guest of honor, along with Rosalia. The heroine couldn't understand why everyone was so eager to see both of her personas at the same time. Antonio tried to decline the invitation, saying that the attendance of a mere servant might cause some problems. Eveline agreed that his reasoning made sense under the current circumstances, but then she suggested that perhaps only Rosalia could attend the banquet. As Antonio tried to dissuade the crown princess again, she worried that her request was too much and explained that she just wanted to show some goodwill to the de Hessen family. Eveline declared that apparently she was destined to appreciate the painting alone and in misery. Although Antonio knew she was deliberately playing pitiful, he still promised to discuss it with Rosalia. After leaving the room, the heroine thought to herself that things were getting more and more complicated, especially now that she also had to prepare for a royal banquet. Before she could sort out her thoughts, His Highness the Crown Prince strolled over. Although she greeted him properly, Esteban felt she was being too cold to someone who knew her secret. Rosalia thought to herself that he should be a little warmer to the crown princess himself. She was about to curtsy and leave when Esteban spoke again. He asked Rosalia if she knew about the Refilio's family, whose members naturally give off a fragrant scent. She didn't understand what he was getting at and asked why he brought it up. Esteban replied that Rosalia clearly didn't know herself as well as she thought. He had heard that she and Baron Hessen were not actually related by blood. When asked if she knew anything about her parents, Rosalia said her mother had passed away early and told her nothing. Esteban said this was her chance to find out the truth, as someone related to her by blood was in the delegation. But the crown prince didn't get to say who it was, because a guard ran up to tell him the envoys had arrived. Esteban promised he would be over as soon as he was done talking, but when he turned around, Rosalia was gone. The crown prince watched the girl run off, a little frustrated because he had wanted to give her some advice. If Rosalia didn't learn to control this on her own, she would be in big trouble later. For Alejandro, it had always been a great honor to serve as the Duke's most trusted secretary. Lord de Baltazar was always completely dedicated to his work, but recently his assistant had noticed that he was acting a bit abnormally. The Duke would suddenly sigh deeply or talk to himself, things he never used to do. Since he seemed to be under a lot of stress, Alejandro decided not to disturb him during those moments. Today, on one such day, the Duke had his assistant call Antonio in. Alejandro set off to carry out the order, thinking that poor Antonio was surely in for it. Antonio nervously entered the Duke's office, thinking he was about to get another earful. But unexpectedly, Klaus asked him about Rosalia, such as whether she had a boyfriend she was promised for the future. Antonio was completely stunned, not understanding why he would ask this. Then the Duke dropped the bombshell. He was interested in his sister. The guy was too shocked to speak for a moment, but Klaus didn't think it was a big deal. I mean, men and women can be attracted to each other, right? Since Antonio just stammered, the Duke grew impatient and asked again. Instead of answering, Antonio blurted out that it was absolutely impossible, that it was forbidden. Our little girl knew exactly how this whole thing would play out, so they absolutely could not be together. To ensure this wouldn't happen, Antonio lied outright that Rosalia already had a fiancé. The Duke was genuinely confused how this so-called lover could stand by and watch her suffer, buried in debt, destitute, and hiding from thugs. Antonio said it was because they lived too far apart. After thinking for a second, Klaus declared that if there were no guards at the door, he would just walk right in. But Antonio thought this was clearly crossing a line. He said Rosalia wasn't planning on seeing anyone anyway, especially since she had a sweetheart. The Duke found Antonio's behavior rather strange. He didn't understand why the guy was reacting this way to someone of his status and wealth. Klaus studied him closely and asked if there was another reason. But then, just as unexpectedly, he suddenly turned and said he understood Antonio's love for his sister, and then told him to get out. Antonio, completely baffled by the cold-blooded tyrant's strange behavior, left the office. Alone, the Duke wondered what on earth he had been expecting and told himself to pull it together and get a grip. He told himself this had nothing to do with Antonio at all. He was just genuinely attracted to Rosalia. Meanwhile, the Crown Prince and Crown Princess welcomed the delegation from Refilio's, welcoming them to Lug Velzet. Marquis Johannes von Euclid stepped forward, took Evelian's hand, and introduced himself. The Marquis smiled, sensing that Her Highness the Crown Princess had something to say to him, and asked what it was. The crown princess was very curious to know, although it might be rude to ask upon their first meeting, if Euclid had a younger brother. Hearing this, Esteban realized Eveline felt the same way he did. However, the Marquis replied that he did not have a younger brother, and the crown princess apologized to him. Esteban also noticed how much the guy resembled Antonio, or more accurately, Rosalia. Then Euclid revealed that he did, in fact, once have a younger sister. The problem was, she went missing over 10 years ago, and to this day, we still don't know if she is alive or dead. The crown princess felt sorry for bringing it up, but the Marquis said it was fine, as it was all in the distant past anyway. Esteban offered to escort Euclid back to his room. Following behind the crown prince and crown princess, the Marquis thought of his sister, someone he hadn't thought about in a very long time. The last time he saw Cecilia and their mother, the girl was only 3 years old. He wondered what Cecilia was doing now, because if she were still alive, she would be a grown woman by now. Arriving at the banquet hall, lavishly decorated for the Refilio's delegation, Chloe was thrilled, while Rosalia clearly was not. It seemed all the nobles in the empire had come to tonight's grand event. Rosalia felt she didn't belong here at all, as she was barely even a noble. But Chloe comforted her, reminding her that she was a guest of honor personally invited by the crown princess. She grabbed her friend's hand and dragged her into the hall, eager to see who had come tonight. Miss Chloe seemed to be quite popular at the banquet, and it wasn't long before she was asked for the first dance. The heroine scanned the room, hoping to find the delegation from Refilio's, as she couldn't wait to meet the second male lead. Nearby, she noticed an incredibly handsome man surrounded by ladies. Just as she was racking her brain to recall how the novel described the character and trying to determine if it was him, His Highness the Crown Prince approached Rosalia. The heroine curtsied, but Esteban gestured for her to stand straight. He felt she was making a bit of a fuss. After all, the last time he tried to help her, she had run off as if she'd seen a ghost. Rosalia tried to justify her escape, saying the crown prince had looked busy and she didn't want to bother him, let alone offend him. Esteban was willing to forgive her, on the condition that she promise him another dance in return. Meanwhile, the Duke called for Alejandro and had him take care of the remaining paperwork. He himself was going to the banquet to make a strong impression and prepare for the upcoming delegation meetings. He planned to focus on official business, not Antonio and Rosalia, hoping the event would help him forget everything. But all those plans went down the drain, because the moment he walked into the ballroom, he saw Rosalia chatting with the crown prince. He didn't know why she was there, but felt a wave of relief that he had run into her and not Antonio. Still, the fact that she was close to the crown prince again really rubbed Klaus the wrong way. Esteban tried to pull Rosalia to the dance floor, claiming he had something important to tell her, but she suggested they just talk. Just then, Klaus walked over, as he also wished to be her first dance partner of the night. The guests began to murmur, whispering about who this lady was that had both the crown prince and Duke de Baltazar vying for her attention. When Esteban reminded Klaus of seniority, Klaus retorted that His Highness should respect Rosalia's choice. As they were busy arguing, she thought, "Why are they putting me through this crap? I can't stand either of them." Then, both men held out their hands to her, leaving the choice to her. But in her mind, a heartless guy was better than a married one, so she chose to dance with the Duke. Klaus was honored by her choice, but Rosalia told him not to get the wrong idea, as she didn't choose him because she had feelings for him. She was sure he didn't like her either, and that he had his own reasons for asking her to dance. In her opinion, Klaus was doing this because of the crown princess. If His Highness danced with Rosalia again, Eveline would be in trouble. Klaus admitted that wasn't entirely true, as he didn't want to lose Rosalia to the crown prince. Her face turned red when she realized he was serious about being interested in her. According to Klaus, he just didn't understand the Rosalia who had the crown prince completely captivated. He told her to turn around, and she saw Esteban staring at her with a murderous gaze, as if trying to burn a hole through her with his eyes. The Duke was sure that as soon as the dance was over, the crown prince would be ready to snatch Rosalia away from him. Since the girl didn't know what to do, Klaus just grabbed her hand and pulled her out of the hall. Without a word, he led Rosalia to a balcony and suggested she stay there until things calmed down. He was curious how much she knew about His Highness. Although Klaus didn't fully understand what was going on, Rosalia had to realize that the crown prince's interest in her would lead to nothing good. But she had never sought his attention and was just as confused about it. As Rosalia was explaining that it had nothing to do with her, the Duke saw Esteban walking by. He covered her mouth with his hand, signaling her to be quiet, and hid with her behind a door. The crown prince didn't notice anyone on the balcony and walked right past. When Klaus turned back and looked at Rosalia, who he was still holding by the shoulders, he froze, completely mesmerized by her. Flustered by how close they were, she asked the Duke to back away a little, but Klaus caressed her face and told her how enchanting she smelled. Then he leaned in and pressed his lips against Rosalia's. She thought to herself that she actually liked the warmth of his lips. But a second later, she came to her senses and pushed him away. Rosalia covered her face and ran off, completely overwhelmed. She bolted down the hall, thinking she must be going crazy as she felt like she was under some kind of spell. Just then, Esteban stopped her, grabbing her by the shoulders and reminding her he had something important to tell her. Although Rosalia didn't want to talk right now, he told her that the entire palace was filled with her scent. The crown prince had wanted to warn her earlier, but it was a headache since she was always running off somewhere. Sooner or later, someone would notice, and she needed to be careful. She suddenly tried to smell herself, not understanding what scent he was talking about. Esteban also warned Rosalia to stay away from the Duke, because although he found it a bit annoying, he was interested in her, and honestly, he didn't want to deal with her at all. Rosalia wondered if she was going to become like Klaus, the one who stirs up trouble between the main characters, but ends up getting taken down after they resolve their differences. She absolutely could not get involved with the Duke, and she had to pull herself together right now. What she didn't know was that a gray-haired man with an eye patch had been watching the whole thing. When our girl returned to the ballroom, Chloe immediately swarmed her. She demanded to know what was so important that Rosalia had to ditch her. Although flashbacks of her kiss with Klaus flashed through her mind, she quickly assured Chloe that she hadn't gone anywhere. Miss Balthazar found her friend's words a bit suspicious. Looking at her, she tried to imagine how Chloe would react if she knew about the kiss with her brother. Remembering Esteban's words, Rosalia asked the girl if she smelled of anything, but she couldn't smell a thing. The heroine wanted to leave the banquet as soon as possible and asked for Chloe's permission, saying she was completely exhausted. Miss Balthazar looked Rosalia over and thought she had a fever, as her face was bright red. She agreed the girl should head back and went to call for a carriage. While waiting for the carriage, the heroine thought about getting out of this place quickly before she ran into Klaus, as she didn't know how to face him now. Just then, the Duke came out of the palace, looking around. Rosalia thought he was looking for her and tried to find a place to hide. At that moment, Marquis Euclid was waiting for his carriage nearby. Since the heroine was focused on watching Klaus to avoid being seen, she wasn't looking where she was going and accidentally bumped into Johannes. Their bright green eyes met, and in that second, the Duke spotted them. Not wanting to deal with Klaus, the heroine apologized for the first meeting and asked the Marquis for a ride. Johannes smiled and offered the girl a ride in his carriage. The Duke, watching this from the side, tried to figure out why those two were leaving together. He remembered Antonio's words and wondered if the Marquis could be Rosalia's secret admirer. Once safe, the heroine thanked the man for so readily agreeing to her sudden request. Euclid was sure the girl had her reasons, so he couldn't refuse her. Rosalia expressed her gratitude and asked him to drop her off somewhere nearby. But Johannes refused, insisting on escorting her home, as it was dangerous for a lady to walk alone late at night. Realizing she couldn't go back to the Duke's estate in this situation, the heroine decided to stay with Nadia for the night. Suddenly, the Marquis asked the girl if she didn't think they looked a bit alike. It wasn't until he said it that Rosalia realized it was indeed true. She blushed a little and said that there are many people in the world who look alike. When Johannes finally introduced himself, Rosalia realized she was face to face with another main character from the novel. He told her he was here as part of the Refilio's delegation, and she admitted she had heard all about him. She peeked out the window, said she lived nearby, and asked him to let her out so she could walk the short distance. Getting out of the carriage, she thanked the Marquis again for his help. As they said their goodbyes, Johannes added that he was very much looking forward to seeing her again. Watching Rosalia leave, he ordered his aide to find out everything about that girl. Even though her hair color was different, she looked too much like someone he had lost a long time ago. Returning from the banquet, an exhausted Chloe was getting ready for bed when Klaus asked his sister where Antonio was. She didn't understand why he was asking, as Antonio should be in his room at this hour. Klaus was surprised by his sister's reaction, but she kept telling him not to bother the guy, as he wasn't feeling well today. The Duke didn't listen, and a few minutes later, he was knocking on Antonio's door. Since no one answered from the bedroom, he opened the door and went in. But the Duke found no one in the room, and the guy's midnight escape piqued his curiosity. The next morning, Nadia demanded Rosalia explain why she had shown up in the middle of the night asking to stay over. She guessed the girl had either been kicked out or it was about some boy. From her reaction to the guess, Nadia was even more convinced she was right. The woman turned back to the canvas on her easel and started coughing, and Rosalia asked if she had taken her medicine. Nadia reassured her that she was taking it on time, but the doctor said it would take some time to fully recover. She smirked and teased Rosalia again, telling her to go think about her sweetheart. After having breakfast with Nadia, our little girl, now dressed as Antonio, finally returned to the Duke's estate. But it turned out Klaus had been waiting for him in his room, growing impatient. Antonio was stunned to see the Duke in his bedroom. Klaus immediately demanded to know where de Hessen had been. This behavior from Klaus was really driving her up the wall. Antonio turned around, looking exhausted, and said it was a private matter. Hearing this, the Duke guessed the guy had a secret lover on the side. Antonio wanted to change, so he asked Klaus to leave his room, but the Duke didn't even budge as he caught that same scent again. He reminded Antonio that he was his boss, and it was his duty to manage and protect his employees. So he wanted to know what private matter kept de Hessen out all night. The guy thought to himself that, employer or not, the Duke had no right to meddle in his private life. Klaus retorted that imperial law gave a duke the right to question a commoner. Sleep-deprived and exhausted, Antonio just wanted to get this over with, so he said he was with a friend. Klaus pressed on, wanted to know the name. When he heard that they didn't know them, the Duke wanted to know if it was a man or a woman. Klaus found it strange, even to himself, why he was even asking this. He had to focus and tell himself he shouldn't care at all if Antonio was having an affair. But then de Hessen interrupted his thoughts, blurting out that the friend was, in fact, a woman. Now that he had to get ready for work, he told the Duke to get going. Klaus, still not moving, said that any private matter could affect work. Antonio thought, dude, it's 7 in the morning. I'm not even on the clock yet. For some reason, the Duke suddenly blew up, telling the guy to watch it. Because de Hessen's tone, his movements, his clothes, and even his cologne were getting on his nerves. After his outburst, he stormed out of the room. The girl was completely dumbfounded, wondering what was wrong with this guy so early in the morning. She thought the Duke was gone, but when she turned around, she was horrified to see he had suddenly decided to come back. Klaus leaned in towards Antonio and ordered him to arrange a meeting with Rosalia as soon as possible. When asked if he could just pass on a message, the Duke sneered that it was a private matter. He also wanted to know where Antonio's sister was living now. The servant lowered his head and replied that Rosalia couldn't meet with him. The heroine couldn't go on like this anymore, refusing to let herself go down this fatal path. So she said that Rosalia was with someone very important right now. The Duke had a hunch who this important person might be, but he didn't get a chance to find out because Antonio yelled that it was a family matter and ran off. Now the Duke was left to wonder. Was Rosalia's relationship with Marquis Euclid closer than he thought? As time went on, the confusion over the whole thing just grew deeper. Later, while watering the flowers in the garden, she wondered why the Duke couldn't just let it go, now that she had made it clear she wasn't interested. Standing nearby, Olin pointed out that she was overwatering and flooding the plants. Abello approached de Hessen, thinking Antonio had gone too far, because his mission was just to deliver the donation, and that was it. The artist noticed the guy was clearly worried about something. Although Antonio said he was fine, Lil Erlin agreed with her dad. Then de Hessen admitted that while it wasn't a big deal, there was someone who had been bothering him. He had absolutely no interest in getting closer to this person, but it was awkward because they had to keep meeting for work. At that thought, she remembered the kiss with the Duke again. She held her head, trying to shake it off, thinking she was going crazy. Suddenly, Abello pointed out that Antonio clearly didn't hate this person. When the guy tried to deny it, the artist wasn't convinced. According to Abello, it didn't matter if Antonio liked the person or not. The point was that he needed to face the problem head on. Running away wouldn't solve anything. Once he figured out where he stood, the anxiety would disappear. Besides, Antonio was a man, and he shouldn't run from his problems. De Hessen thanked Abello for the advice, saying it had really helped him. She was going to give that Duke a firm rejection and be done with it. And so she said goodbye to the Hans. Walking down the street, she saw an old man being roughly thrown out of a bar. The guy was angry because he was mistaken for a beggar, saying he had money. But when he reached into his pocket, he found it was empty. The owner walked away, grumbling, and Antonio rushed over to help the old man up. But the old man just got angry and started accusing the young man of stealing his money. Antonio wanted to help the old man and take him home, but he yelled that he didn't need any help and could find his own way. Realizing there was nothing he could do, the guy left the stranger and went on his way. But after a few steps, Antonio turned back and saw the old man still standing in the same spot. He rushed to the man's side, grabbed his arm, and asked if he remembered his address. It was obvious now that the old man had dementia. No wonder he was having trouble. The man kept insisting he could get home on his own, but Antonio kept pushing him to give up and say the address. Finally, the old man said the name of a street, though he didn't sound too sure. Antonio took his hand and led him along. She cursed herself for her bad habit of meddling. They arrived at the right house, and, standing before the huge gate, she wasn't sure if this was the right place. However, the old man opened the gate and headed into the manor's courtyard, despite Antonio's attempts to stop him. The name Berna's was written on the gate. The old man turned to the young man and asked if he was waiting for a special invitation, telling him to follow. When asked if he owned this mansion, the man retorted, did he look like the kind of person who would just barge into someone else's house? The heroine couldn't believe her luck that she was able to meet the artist, Count Waldro de Bernus. The mansion was covered in cobwebs and looked completely abandoned. Waldro said everyone had abandoned him because he forgot to pay them. In fact, in the original story, this guy also showed signs of mental decline. But when Waldro was lucid, he created true masterpieces, and just one painting could pay off all his debts. Antonio looked around, but there wasn't a single painting to be seen in the whole place. He asked Mr. Bernas if he was still creating art. The old man stared at him, as if to say, seriously, do I look like I'm still capable of that? Just as Antonio was wondering how to answer, Waldro suddenly asked what he was doing in his house. Marquis Euclidean's secretary, Logan, had brought him the investigation report. The intelligence showed that after Baron Hessen's death, his children, Antonio and Rosalia, were paying off his debts together. But the main point was they were not related by blood. After the Baron remarried, he officially adopted Rosalia and her mother. Johannes was desperate to know when this had happened. When he heard it was 19 years ago, his heart stopped. The Marquis clutched his head. 20 years ago was exactly when his mother and Cecilia had disappeared. At that time, he was in the carriage with them when some cloaked figures blocked the road. When the carriage overturned, Johannes was pinned underneath. He could only watch helplessly through a crack as his mother and sister were dragged away. The timeline of all this matched perfectly with when the Baron got married, thinking his mother might still be alive. The Marquis asked Logan about Rosalia's mother, but it turned out that the lady had passed away 18 years ago. Johannes dismissed his assistant. Alone, he thanked the man for his hard work and pondered why his mother hadn't returned to the Marquis. Perhaps someone was trying to kill them, so she wanted to hide Cecilia's and his identity. Maybe it was just wishful thinking, but Johannes had to find out if Rosalia was truly Cecilia. Meanwhile, after cleaning Walter de Bernas's house from top to bottom, our heroine felt refreshed. After tidying up, she made him dinner so he could regain his strength, get well soon, and start painting again. After taking a bite of food, Waldo suddenly felt a strange chill. Our heroine promised to come again tomorrow and return to the ducal estate by carriage. Inside the carriage, she took off Antonio's clothes and changed back into Rosalia's attire. The girl agreed with Mr. Abello's view that running away from problems solves nothing. She needed to face it head on. After arriving at the manor, she thanked the coachman and asked him to place her luggage in the main building's hall. The coachman stared in confusion at the passenger's back. It was a man before getting on the carriage, and now suddenly it was a young lady. The Duke was in his study, his mind filled with the kiss with Rosalia. He was informed that Miss de Hessen had arrived. Klaus turned to face his desk, determined to have a calm conversation this time. He told himself to stay calm and clear his thoughts. Then he let the girl in. Rosalia appeared at the door, her beauty lighting up the entire room. The Duke pretended to be busy with work, trying to maintain his composure. He asked her where she had been all this time. Although Rosalia said it was difficult to talk about, he needed to know if she was with that man. No matter how hard Klaus tried to hold back, the words slipped out. He glared at her, demanding to know if she was with that person, the one she had been seeing. Rosalia thought it was irrelevant and none of the Duke's business. She came here today to clarify one thing. She said she had no feelings for Klaus, so she asked him to stop bothering her and Antonio. The Duke laughed. He stood up from his desk and walked over to Rosalia. He leaned in towards her and asked what exactly happened that day if she had no feelings for him. She said she was just acting on impulse, and that she already had someone she loved. The kiss meant nothing and was a mistake. The Duke decided to see if Rosalia would also consider this a mistake and kissed her again. He felt her relax and kiss him back. Klaus looked into her eyes and concluded, even if Rosalia had a lover, she was still willing to do this kind of thing with him. He seriously doubted she could still call it a mistake now. The heroine thought this must be the original novel's Rosalia's feelings acting up, and she admitted that her body was indeed attracted to Klaus, but that was all. Even if her body craved him, she wouldn't throw away her future for a relationship with no future. Because in the end, they were just a debtor and a creditor, bound by money and their mutual needs. When the day comes that they slander her again, call her a traitor, and drag her to the guillotine, the Duke won't lift a finger to save her. Klaus looked bewildered. What on earth are you talking about, betrayal? Rosalia retorted that the Duke was not the type to do anything that would disadvantage him. He was more the type to ruthlessly discard anything he deemed worthless. She was very sure she saw him for who he was. Klaus told her stop, saying it was absurd to react like this over something so baseless. But to Rosalia, the fact that he didn't even deny it said everything. She told him not to try to fool her with insincere sweet talk and walked out of the Duke's office. The girl left the manor, certain that this should be enough to avoid her fate in the original story. She wouldn't die, and that was the most important thing right now. And yet, despite acting so confident, Rosalia found herself in tears for some reason. The girl blamed it all on the body of her character. It clearly had a mind of its own. Just as she was about to walk out the main gate, Marquis Euclian approached from the other side. Although Johannes's assistant doubted they could see the Duke without an appointment, he didn't care. He wasn't here to see Balthazar, but his servant, Antonio. Strangely enough, tracking Rosalia had proven impossible. So, her stepbrother who worked at the ducal manor was the only one who might know anything. Just then, the gate swung open. Johannes saw Rosalia standing right there. Behind her, the Duke suddenly appeared and grabbed the girl's arm, his face full of anger. Rosalia begged him to let go, but Klaus was furious that she had left before he could finish speaking. But their argument was interrupted by the sudden appearance of Marquis Euclian, who demanded to know what was going on. Johannes ignored the question about why he was there and pushed the Duke's hand off her. Then he pulled Rosalia aside and coldly asked Klaus if he couldn't see she was not in a good state. After confirming she was all right, the Marquis examined her reddened wrist. Klaus just stood there silently, not even understanding what had come over him just now. Meanwhile, Johannes said that perhaps he should come back another day. Then he smelled it. The scent that strongly indicated Rosalia was definitely from their family. The Raffilio's family has a special, unique body odor, like a pheromone, that cannot be detected by the same sex, but is strongly felt by the opposite sex, especially when emotions like joy, sadness, or affection are heightened. Johannes was certain the person before him was Cecilia and suggested they go somewhere else together, if she would agree. He was ecstatic to have finally found his sister after so many years. She must have been enduring everything alone in this foreign land. After hopping into the carriage, Johannes couldn't wait to tell the girl he was her brother, but he knew the timing wasn't right. Our heroine looked up and met the Marquis's deep and intense gaze. This man who had saved her again, Euclian, asked if she was in trouble with the Duke, because from his perspective, the situation seemed serious. Rosalia replied that she and Mr. Balthazar had a working relationship, and they just had a disagreement over work matters. Hearing this, Johannes guessed that she was indeed struggling to pay off the Baron's debts. Citing an urgent matter, she asked to be dropped off there. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of disappointment in the Marquis's eyes. His gaze was glued to her. Johannes almost called out Cecilia's name, then asked if they could meet again. Noticing Rosalia's strange reaction, he told her not to misunderstand. Johannes said it wasn't what she was thinking. She just looked a lot like his sister. Then he told her she could come to him if she ever needed anything. For help. Getting out of the carriage, Rosalia could only think about how messy this whole situation was. The second male lead was supposed to be a detestable guy, but for some reason, it was the complete opposite. After that incident, the heroine returned to her busy daily routine. She worked desperately day and night to help the Count recover his memories. It turned out that things weren't as easy as they first seemed. But if Bernas could start painting again, Rosalia could finally pay off her debt and leave this place. So, during a visit to Mr. Waldrow, the heroine discovered a portrait of his son at the painter's residence. According to the old man, his son was at the front lines, leading the Empire's top naval fleet. He called his son a good-for-nothing, saying that no matter how busy he was with state affairs, he should at least come back to see if his father was dead or alive. The heroine knew the Count himself had also been a military man, so she asked about his glory days. Waldo had sailed the Callio's Sea, leading a fleet of dozens of ships. He had even encountered the sea monster, the Kraken, a few times. As Waldo recounted the story of winning the Battle of Clayman and meeting the royal family, the heroine was happy she could bring back some good memories for the old man. But suddenly, the Count's face darkened as he remembered how many comrades he had lost back then. He started shouting for the fleet to retreat, to leave the wounded behind, and only let the living on board. Although it took a while, Antonio eventually managed to calm Waldo down. The old man's behavior just now was as if he had returned to the battlefield. Clearly, the pain of those memories still haunted him. No matter how much the heroine needed the money, she didn't want to push things this far. Just as Antonio was pleading for Waldo's forgiveness, the doorbell rang. The visitor kept ringing the bell incessantly. Antonio ran to get the door. When he opened it and saw Miss Closette standing there, de Hessen was completely caught off guard. Seeing that her friend had been avoiding her lately, Miss Balthazar went to great lengths to find her hiding place. Closette smiled sweetly and asked where the Count was, wanting to greet him first. But when the girl approached Mr. Bernays, he crossed his arms and declared he wouldn't buy anything from her. No matter how hard Miss Balthazar tried to explain who she was, he wouldn't listen to a word. She began to doubt if he was really the painter Rosalia was looking for. The girl said it was definitely Waldrow. He was just in such a bad state that she hadn't seen his work yet. Knowing Rosalia needed this old man to solve her brother's problem quickly, Closette asked if she could help. She grabbed some paints, scribbled a house that looked like a child's drawing on the canvas, and then asked the Count to critique her masterpiece. Waldo glanced at her doodle and said he could paint better with his feet, so the girl challenged him to prove it with his actions. Since the stubborn old man refused to prove anything to her, Closette had Antonio bring another canvas. The girl really got into it and planned to continue, thinking it was great fun. As she wondered what to paint this time, Antonio brought the Count some snacks. Without looking up from the canvas, Closette told him to save some for her. The girl decided to paint the vase next to her, speaking loudly on purpose so Waldo could hear. She muttered to herself, wondering what was wrong with her painting. Finally, the old man couldn't take it anymore. He gave in, walked up to Closette, and snatched the brush from her hand. He began to correct the painting, explaining that she had used too much paint, and now the vase stood out more than the flowers. He declared that the focus should be the bouquet, and then stood before the canvas for a moment. When Waldo finally stepped back, Antonio and Closette approached the painting, unable to hide their amazement. The details were so precise. There was no doubt they were looking at a true master. Chloe started gushing about her grandfather's talent, saying her painting was so much better thanks to him. The man silently stared at his right hand for a moment, the one he had just held the brush with. Then he suddenly announced he was hungry and told Antonio to make something. Chloe told the Count not to order the guy around, saying he was her servant, not his. Then, without warning, Waldo pointed at our heroine and asked why she was wearing men's clothes. But when Rosalia asked him to repeat himself, the Count just went back to saying he was hungry. Afterwards, Waldo didn't even remember what he had said. Back at the ducal estate, Chloe was still shaken. She was so scared her heart was still pounding. Antonio admitted he got super nervous too, thinking they were about to be exposed. Just then, the Duke appeared behind them without warning, very curious about what they were almost exposed for. He demanded that we tell him what happened and how we were almost exposed. But Closette told her brother to mind his own business and walked away, pulling Antonio's hand. Klaus called out to Hessen and asked if Rosalia had said anything to him. But since he said his sister hadn't mentioned anything in particular, the Duke let him go. Afterwards, he headed to the Imperial Palace for a meeting with the delegation from Raphelios. The Duke approached Marquis Euclian and accused him of being rather rude earlier. Johannes thanked him for making time for the meeting and asked what Mr. de Balthazar wanted from him. Euclian had heard that the man before him only used others as pawns to achieve his goals. But when the Duke suddenly asked about his romance with Rosalia, Johannes started laughing. The Marquis didn't know what was going on, but he had a feeling something interesting was about to happen. So he told him that he and Rosalia had indeed gotten back together after so long. This made him incredibly happy, as he had been waiting for this for a long time. Seeing how seriously the Duke was listening, Johannes realized that Cecilia had really gotten to this guy. Meanwhile, at the ducal estate, the heroine was admiring one of Closette's paintings. According to her, she painted it following Mr. Waldrow's advice. The heroine marveled that she had never noticed this treasure right under her nose and couldn't understand why the original novel didn't describe. This side of Closette. Suddenly, Klaus entered the room, placed a covered cage on the table, and said he thought of his sister the moment he saw it, so he bought it for her. The girl was surprised. What was with her brother, bringing a gift himself instead of having a servant do it? Lifting the cover, Closette stared in awe at the incredibly cute canary inside the cage. The girl blushed, feeling a bit flustered, and thanked Klaus for the gift. Then she ran to her brother, asking for his suggestion on a name for the bird. The heroine watched this scene, her jaw on the floor. She never thought she would see the Duke smile like that. Klaus turned to Antonio and, without warning, asked him to get some tea. As they sat by the fireplace, the Duke sensed the guy's awkwardness and told him to relax. The heroine was completely baffled. What on earth was wrong with this guy to change so much? After a moment, the Duke praised Antonio for his amazing progress, having only 1,000 ballons left to pay in less than 3 months. To be honest, he hadn't expected de Hessen to pay off even half of it. The heroine looked away, not wanting to see the Duke smile. She was afraid she might actually fall for him. Then, unexpectedly, Klaus said that even after Antonio paid off the debt, he could continue to stay at the manor. He recognized Hessen's talent and his unique eye for art. Antonio needed a stable income to take care of his sister, and the Duke was willing to support them, maybe even find them a nearby estate. However, de Hessen refused the offer, planning to leave as soon as the debt was paid. In fact, she hadn't thought about where to go, as her only goal was to leave the ducal estate. Just then, Klaus interjected, asking if she and her sister were going to Refilio's. In his opinion, it made sense, since Marquis Euclian was said to be Rosalia's lover. Antonio was taken aback at first, but he decided to play along, saying that was exactly right. His hand was shaking so much that when he tried to put down his cup, it clattered to the floor. As she wiped up the spilled tea, she wondered why the Duke thought the Marquis was her man. She wasn't sure if she should go this far with a lie, but since Johannes was playing along, she decided to explain the whole situation to him later. Out of nowhere, the Duke blurted out that Antonio and Rosalia always smelled the same, though he knew it sounded a bit strange. The guy tried to brush it off, saying he and his sister used the same soap. The Duke stood up from his chair and, for the last time, told Antonio to seriously consider his offer. The heroine left the office, still wondering why Klaus was suddenly being so nice. Although she had sworn never to change clothes again, she had to do it one more time. Rosalia and Closette set off for the imperial palace to visit the crown princess. Sitting in the garden, Miss de Baltazar was excitedly telling the story of how Antonio fell into the water because of her hat. Eveline was glad to hear Antonio was okay and asked if it was true that the Duke had saved him. According to her, although you couldn't tell at first glance, Klaus did have a gentle side. The crown princess laughed, reminding Closette of the time 8 years ago when he brought his sister a live rabbit. Klaus had said he was going to skin it to make a muff for her. As a result, Closette felt sorry for the little creature and cried her eyes out. Miss Balthazar didn't find the story funny, as her brother's actions had traumatized her. To change the subject, Rosalia thanked the crown princess for the invitation and replied that she was always happy to make time for people she liked. Then Closette decided to ask Eveline if it was true that people from the Refilio's family were born with a strong scent. Rosalia almost choked, thinking the girl was about to ask the crown princess about the Marquis. According to Eveline, she had only read about it in old records, so she didn't know much. But such a bloodline did exist in the past. It was almost gone now, and even if someone inherited these traits, it would be hard to tell. The crown princess had heard that methods to control the scent were passed down in their family, so there was no obvious difference from ordinary people. Just then, Marquis Euclian passed by the gazebo and noticed Cecilia was there. And while Closette was getting excited about the incredible story, our heroine thought to herself that she had assumed Esteban's words were pure nonsense, but now it was clearly true. Johannes interrupted the girls' conversation and asked if he could have a cup of tea. The crown princess didn't mind, but she was waiting for her friend's opinions. The Marquis apologized for his impertinence and was about to leave. Chloe stopped him, saying it was all fine. The crown princess invited the Marquis to sit with them. The heroine caught a faint scent from him, which was probably the one Eve Lion was talking about. Johannes turned to Rosalia, asked how she was doing, and said it was good to see her again. After the tea party, the girls returned to the ducal estate. Escorted by the Marquis, Chloe whispered to her friend, asking when she had gotten to know Euclian. She replied that they had met by chance at the royal ball. The heroine decided to take this opportunity to talk to Johannes about their supposed relationship as lovers. He moved closer to Rosalia and gently picked a fallen petal from her hair. He could smell her rich fragrance, which meant her blooming period was approaching. She must not know how to control it yet, as the scent was getting stronger. This could put Rosalia in danger. Since she didn't understand why he had just touched her hair, Johannes showed her the petal. He thought to himself that he had to be by Cecilia's side, no matter what when she bloomed. Just then, the Duke came down the hallway, saw this scene, and clenched his fists in jealous rage. Balthazar thought it was quite bold of her to invite a guest to the manor without telling him. She wasn't ready for this meeting, especially in Rosalia's clothes. The Marquis apologized for coming unannounced. The Duke invited his guest to stay and rest. Then he turned to Rosalia and asked for a word with her. But Johannes cut in directly, saying that was impossible as he and the girl were about to have a private conversation. As Rosalia's boyfriend, the Marquis hoped His Grace the Duke would understand his position. He turned to the girl, smiled, and winked at her. Rosalia was stunned, having no idea how Marquis Euclian knew about this. Johannes seized the moment and demanded that the Duke stop treating Rosalia with such disrespect. Although Klaus understood the guy was protecting his woman, he reminded the Marquis that this was not Refilio's and advised him not to overstep in Lugversit. Johannes argued that protecting the woman he loved had nothing to do with location, and that it was important for him that Rosalia felt comfortable wherever she was. He declared that if anyone got in her way, he would not back down, be it the Duke, the Crown Prince, or the Emperor himself. The girl couldn't stand their bickering any longer, stepped between the two men, and told them to stop. Seeing a soldier running towards them, she tried to send the Marquis away, claiming someone was calling for him. Johannes felt he had no choice but to leave, but reminded Rosalia one last time that she could come to him for any help she needed. After seeing him off, she asked the Duke what he wanted to talk about. Since Rosalia was here, Klaus suggested they have a meal together. She was about to refuse, but when she looked up at the Duke, she saw a pleading look in his eyes. Guessing she might regret it later, she agreed to have dinner with him. And so, she sat at the dining table with Klaus and Cosette. The dining room was so quiet that Rosalia began to suffocate from the awkwardness. Cosette was the first to snap, declaring she couldn't eat in this atmosphere. She asked her brother what was wrong with him, suddenly doing all these completely incomprehensible things. The Duke remained calm and replied peacefully that he just thought it would be nice to eat with her and Rosalia, and that was a shame Antonio couldn't make it. She said in a sarcastic tone that her brother was probably too busy right now, paying off debts. Klaus noticed she had barely touched her food and offered to get her something else. Seeing her brother act so nice, Cosette started to think he was possessed or something. The Duke suggested they have the chef make something new, but Rosalia refused. Meanwhile, Cosette continued to freak out, saying her brother's body had been taken over by some evil spirit. But Klaus just calmly said, as usual, that he was fine. That night, back in her room, she stood before an open suitcase. Because she was so freaked out by the Duke's strange behavior, she had decided to pack up and leave this place. But then, Klaus's voice came from behind her without warning. He asked if it was normal for Rosalia to leave just like that without saying goodbye to her brother. She grabbed her bag, saying she could see Antonio another day. The Duke had an "I'm surprised the Marquis isn't helping you pay off this debt" look on his face. But Rosalia retorted that it was a family matter and had nothing to do with Johannes. Then Klaus asked how her wrist was, after he had squeezed it so hard. He heard she was fine and tried to justify his actions, saying he was just acting on impulse. Rosalia smelled the alcohol on the Duke and said, "That never stopped you from treating me however you wanted before." Klaus admitted it and apologized directly, to Rosalia. "I shouldn't have said those things, and I truly regret it," the Duke confessed. But he added, "If I were the Marquis, I would pay off all the damn debts for my woman, just so she wouldn't have to be with anyone." She looked into Klaus's eyes and thought, has he really fallen for me? Impossible. He pinned her against the wall, moved closer, and pleaded, "Don't go with that man." Klaus spoke in a gentle and sincere tone that the heroine had never heard from him before. But she had no choice but to push the Duke away, telling him she had to go. As she turned, she saw the look in Klaus's eyes as he watched her leave. Rosalia could feel that she had changed this ruthless man and made him warmer. But the girl told herself to get a grip because this couldn't possibly be happening. Once outside, she sat right down on the ground and curled up, hugging her knees. Rosalia had promised herself she would never fall for him, and now she tried to blame it all on the wine she had at dinner. The heroine decided to give herself some time, thinking everything would eventually go back to normal. The next day, Cosette and Antonio went out for a walk, enjoying the beautiful sunny day. Since Miss Balthazar hadn't been able to ask her friend yesterday, she wanted to know when exactly Marquis Euclion had become her sweetheart. She had just confessed to lying to the Duke about being head over heels for Johannes. Cosette thought that if the Marquis was playing along, maybe he was really interested in her. He must have feelings for Rosalia, otherwise there was no reason to be so nice to her. Hearing her friend's wild speculations, she started making faces. It was comfortable being with the Marquis, but she had absolutely no romantic feelings for him. She insisted that wasn't the case, and that Euclid was probably just teasing her. Meanwhile, the Duke was watching Cosette and Antonio walking in the garden from his window. He stared blankly at de Hessen, who was grinning like a fool. Alejandro interrupted the Duke's thoughts, asking what his grace was staring so intently at. Klaus was startled and denied there was anything outside the window, but his reaction only made him look more guilty. The Duke accused Alejandro of having nothing better to do than tiptoe around his office. The secretary reminded him that he was the one who had asked him to organize the documents. The secretary updated the Duke on the school's construction, mentioning the shops and residential areas. But Klaus wasn't listening at all. He was still thinking about how he had just been unconsciously staring at Antonio, simply because he looked so much like his sister. After spending the night at Count Barnabas's house, she put him to bed and left the room. Closing the door behind her, she stretched in relief, as another day of work was finally over. Even so, she didn't want to return to the ducal residence, as she didn't know how to face Klaus now. To kill time, she decided to tidy up the Count's estate a bit. She entered Waldro's study and noticed a large pile of documents on the floor. As she picked them up, she found a letter from the Eskimo naval base among them. The letter stated that Lord Ashton de Bernas, Count Waldro's son, had been killed in action. The next morning, Antonio went to see the Count to talk about his son. Waldro started cursing his son again, calling him an ungrateful brat who couldn't even be bothered to call his own father. De Hessen changed his mind, not wanting to break the old man's heart, and hid the letter. The letter said that Bernas's son had died in battle 6 months ago. As far as she knew, the Count had also fainted around the same time, and that's when his memory problems began. Looking at the old man, she thought that perhaps it was better for him not to remember anything. As she left the Count's estate with a heavy heart, a hooded figure suddenly ran towards her. He bumped her with his elbow as he ran past. She fell to the ground, but the stranger didn't even stop to apologize. He just kept running. Looking around, she realized she was at a school construction site. Then, a memory flashed back. The Dreamleaf incident from the original novel. It was the turning point that shattered the relationship between the Duke and the Crown Prince. Dream leaves cause insane hallucinations and are highly addictive, so the Empire strictly regulated them. Klaus was arrested for trying to trade the stuff, and the goods were found on the Duke's construction site. The protagonist jumped to her feet and chased after the stranger, shouting for him to stop. She demanded he explain what he was doing, as she knew the workers should have gone home by now. So far, Klaus had only made money through completely legal businesses, so it was likely someone had deliberately planted the illegal items there. The protagonist was about to catch up to the hooded person, but he suddenly turned and swung a heavy beam at her. She blocked the attack, with only one thought in her mind. Klaus might be getting framed. The protagonist was hit hard on the head and fell to the ground, while the culprit escaped. Watching him run away, Rosalia felt she had to tell someone that there was a plot to frame the Duke. Back at the Balthazar estate, Antonio burst into the Duke's study, saying it was an emergency. But when Klaus gave him his full attention, de Hessen stammered, having no idea how to explain any of this. Yeah, Yeah, the protagonist knew the future and that dream leaves were supposed to be hidden at the construction site, but she didn't know how to tell the Duke someone was trying to frame him. Because how would she know that? So, Antonio said a suspicious person was lurking around the school site and that they should go check it out. Noticing the scrape on his hand, the Duke asked him what happened. Antonio pulled his hand back, saying that was completely irrelevant right now. Realizing de Hessen was actually at the construction site, Klaus sighed and told him not to wander around where he shouldn't be. He ordered him to go to the infirmary now, as Dr. Nelson should still be awake at this hour. The Duke insisted the area was secure and practically pushed Antonio towards the door. De Hessen just wanted to talk, but Klaus wouldn't hear any of it until he got his wound checked to prevent it from getting worse. Finally, Antonio compromised and promised to go to the infirmary. But surprisingly, she actually headed to the construction site herself, wanting to get to the bottom of things. She harshly scolded herself for always being so meddlesome. Rosalia thought to herself, why am I here waiting for that bastard to come back? I shouldn't care if Klaus lives or dies. Meanwhile, the Duke himself appeared at the construction site, despite Alejandro trying to convince him to come back during the day. Klaus apologized to his secretary for dragging him out so late. If he was cold, he could go back first. But Alejandro didn't want to leave his boss. Who else would be there for him, right? The Duke said he was just going to take a quick look at the construction site and would be right back. And what do you know, just then, she spotted the same hooded guy who had bumped into her earlier. She watched him closely, trying to see where he would hide the dream leaves. Just then, Rosalia saw the culprit hide a small pouch under a beam. As he fled, the guy dropped something that looked like a brooch or something. Whatever it was, I have to focus on collecting the evidence now. Sure enough, just as she expected, she found the dream leaves under the beam. Well, it seems someone is trying to frame Klaus. Meanwhile, the guy who fled the scene realized he had dropped something. He returned to where he thought he dropped it and saw a guy bending over by the beams. Antonio turned around, trying to figure out what to do now. Just then, the support beam under his feet suddenly collapsed. He fell fast. When de Hessen opened his eyes, he found himself pinned under the collapsed beams, with the Duke holding them up to keep them from crushing him. Hearing a loud crash, Alejandro rushed over to help his grace. As he searched for his master under the rubble, a hooded figure fled the scene. A blood-soaked Klaus was shielding Antonio. De Hessen saw him trembling, struggling to bear the weight of the beams on his back, on the verge of collapsing. Duke Klaus told Antonio not to move. Hearing Alejandro's voice from above, she yelled at him that the Duke was injured. The secretary frantically rushed off to get the workers for help. Antonio was horrified by the blood on Klaus's back and asked if he was in pain and what they should do now. The Duke told the kid to shut up, saying his words were only making him weaker. He told Antonio to stay still, because if anything happened to him, it would only stress him out more. It was getting harder for Klaus, but he was glad the beams had fallen on him instead of Hessen. I mean, looking at Hessen's build, it seemed like a light touch could break him in two. The protagonist noticed a drop of sweat slide down the Duke's chin. She reached out and gently wiped the sweat from his face. Klaus angrily reminded Antonio that he had told him not to move. Alejandro found some workers, and they were already trying to dig the Duke and de Hessen out from under the rubble. When they were finally rescued, the secretary barraged Klaus with questions about what happened, why the building collapsed, and why Antonio was here. Just then, a panicked Closette ran to the construction site. Hearing what had happened, she was worried sick and rushed to see if Antonio was okay. De Hessen said he was fine, but the same couldn't be said for the Duke. According to him, things would have been much worse if it weren't for Klaus. Suddenly, tears streamed down Closette's face. Antonio was filled with guilt, saying he was sorry the Duke got hurt because of him. But she told him to stay still, insisting it wasn't his fault, and then walked over to her brother. Klaus told his sister to calm down, saying he was fine, and that she needed to get some sleep. Crying, Chloe reminded him that their father had once said the same thing, that his injuries weren't deep. Back then, he was lying in bed, covered in bandages, stroking his daughter's head and telling her not to worry. Dad said it wasn't a serious injury and promised that he and Mom would get better, and then we could all go for a picnic by the pond again. In the original story, the Duke and Duchess died young in a carriage accident, leaving Klaus and Closette orphaned in an instant. Mom died on the spot, while Dad passed away after returning to the estate. That trauma really broke her mentally. Closette started screaming, telling Klaus he'd better not die and leave her alone, or she would never call him brother again. The Duke just stared at his sister, which made her even angrier. Finally, he reached out and patted Closette's head. Klaus told his sister not to say such terrible things, because he would never die and would never leave her alone. The girl pouted and shook her fist at her brother. Then she ordered him and Antonio to return to the estate immediately and get their wounds treated right away. Cosette huffed in annoyance, put on a haughty air with her nose in the air, and led the way back to the estate. Klaus and Antonio looked at each other and smiled, finding her behavior amusing. The Duke's wounds were bandaged, and the doctor advised him to change the dressing frequently to avoid scarring. According to Alejandro, Antonio only had a few scrapes and was fine. Suddenly, the secretary remembered that the workers had found something at the construction site. While clearing the rubble, he showed the Duke a dream leaf plant, which had apparently been hidden under the building's beams. Alejandro suggested an investigation to see if the plant was deliberately hidden there. But since it was late, Klaus postponed the investigation and let the secretary leave alone. Alone, the Duke reflected that if things had gone differently, he could have been in an imperial prison. Someone was clearly trying to frame him, but it was unclear how Antonio had found out. Klaus reached for a bandage to change his dressing, just as de Hessen knocked on his door. He had come to formally thank the Duke, as everything had happened so fast before that he hadn't been able to thank him properly. Besides that, he was about to tell the Duke something, but when he walked in and looked up, his cheeks instantly flushed red. The Duke was standing in the middle of the room, shirtless, rebandaging his torn torso. Klaus didn't understand why his appearance made the guy so flustered. He was just changing his bandages, for goodness sake. He told Antonio to get to the point. Antonio pulled an item from his pocket, the thing the person who planted the dream leaves had dropped at the construction site. The Duke examined the small trinket, but the crest on it didn't belong to any noble family he knew. The thing looked like a badge wore on the chest, but for some reason, it was missing a pin. Now, there was no doubt, if someone really planted that thing on the site, then the whole affair was definitely suspicious. Meanwhile, de Hessen was trying hard to recall which key detail from the original novel he had missed. If Klaus wasn't the mastermind, then who was trying to frame him? Suddenly, he had a hunch and rushed to share it with the Duke. Antonio thought it might be wise to connect this incident to Grand Duke Rebelio. Klaus yelled in shock, asking if he realized what he was saying. The Grand Duke was practically royalty, and Antonio had to know how serious these accusations were. Grand Duke Rebelio was the Emperor's brother, the Crown Prince's uncle, and basically the next in line for the throne. In the original story, this guy was just a minor character, so the protagonist hadn't thought much of him. Klaus said that if anyone heard Antonio say that, he would be hanged for disrespecting the royal family. Hessen understood, but he just wanted to remind the Duke to be careful, you know. Klaus couldn't deny that there was some truth to his words. He said that Antonio was just as unpredictable as Rosalia, always stirring up some unexpected trouble. The Duke put the evidence in a box and told de Hessen to stay out of it from now on. He told him to curb his curiosity, never to say such things again, and to forget the whole thing. Antonio tried to argue, but Klaus sharply ordered him to shut up, saying it was too risky. One wrong word, and this guy could disappear, especially after he almost died today. The Duke turned away, calmed down a bit, and told Antonio to lay low here for a while. The protagonist felt Klaus's concern, but his true intentions were still a mystery to her. He had already saved her twice, even as Antonio, and she had yet to repay him. Antonio approached the Duke and asked to at least let him help with his bandages. Klaus refused, telling him to get his hands off, saying it would only make things weird for men to do that. Nevertheless, the protagonist knew her conscience wouldn't be clear if she didn't, so she pleaded with the Duke to let her help. Klaus finally agreed, but only if Antonio did it as quickly as possible. As the Duke sat there awkwardly, the protagonist bandaged his wounds, though it was harder than she had imagined. Just as she was finally about to finish, their faces were so close that her heart began to pound like crazy. When their eyes met, the Duke felt awkward again and told Antonio to get lost, even though Hessen wasn't finished with the bandage. Klaus coldly repeated that it was enough. Not understanding why the Duke was suddenly upset, Antonio bowed and left. The protagonist thought he was making a big deal out of nothing, getting so worked up over a poorly wrapped bandage. Alone, Klaus tried to figure out what had been wrong with him lately. The thought that he might have feelings for Antonio was messing with his head. The Duke couldn't believe it. Was he really attracted to both men and women? But there was an even bigger problem, because he couldn't possibly have feelings for a brother and sister at the same time. That was just impossible. The next day, Klaus showed the brooch he found to Alejandro. He told his secretary that Antonio said someone had deliberately hidden dream leaves at the construction site. The Duke ordered a thorough investigation, as that thing could be a key piece of evidence. Klaus also ordered a bodyguard to be quietly assigned to Antonio, as he couldn't leave his inner circle unprotected. Knowing someone was out to get him, the Duke himself was preparing to go to the Imperial Palace for a while. Upon arrival, Klaus reported to the Crown Prince about the dream leaves found at the construction site. He also informed him of his intention to investigate and bring the culprit to justice. After listening, Esteban made a few of his usual jokes at the Duke's expense, then suggested taking a look at the dream leaves he had brought. Looking at him, Klaus wondered how the once promising Crown Prince could have changed so much. It seemed to have started after the Empress's death. From that day on, Esteban had changed, becoming paranoid about every little thing. Yeah, it was a tragedy, but back then Klaus was fighting for his family's reputation. So to him, the Crown Prince was just a pathetic loser. After examining the dream leaves, Esteban said he was glad the Duke had visited in person, although an investigation was indeed necessary. Klaus wasn't sure if he was genuinely happy or just being sarcastic. Then the Crown Prince suddenly asked about Antonio. Esteban told him not to take it to heart. He was just curious since he hadn't seen the guy in a long time. With another sarcastic smile, he asked the Duke if he knew anything about the Refilio's family. After getting an affirmative answer, the Crown Prince wanted to know if he was aware of their unique scent. Balthazar had no idea what he was talking about. Then Esteban gave Klaus a friendly pat on the shoulder, said it was just a random thought, and asked him to send his regards to Antonio. Watching the Crown Prince leave, the Duke wondered when the two of them had become so familiar. Esteban brought the hallucinogenic herb to his uncle, explaining that it was planted at Duke de Balthazar's place. You want to know what Glodda Robilio thought about it? The Grand Duke twirled the dream leaf in his hand. Lost in thought, he figured that if Klaus were behind this, he wouldn't have brought the herb to his highness. As far as he knew, the Duke was loyal to the royal family and unlikely to be involved in any dirty business. Esteban was shocked that his uncle still believed in de Balthazar's loyalty. He clearly remembered that they were the ones who killed his mother. Glodden understood the Crown Prince's feelings, but reminded him that there was no evidence to prove that the Empress was murdered. Still, Esteban couldn't understand how a perfectly healthy person could suddenly drop dead. He was convinced his mother was poisoned by the noble faction to weaken the imperial authority. The old emperor had been dead for a long time, but they still refused to acknowledge him. Esteban would never forgive them. He planned to make them pay for everything: the Balthazar Duchy, the Herden Marquiate, and the whole damn noble faction. Therefore, the Crown Prince entrusted his uncle with keeping a close watch on the duchy. He believed that if anyone tried to rebel against the royal family, Duke de Balthazar would surely be the one to lead them. Esteban also ordered him to monitor the Crown Princess. She's acting calm now, but the moment we let our guard down, she'll make a move. The Crown Prince placed a hand on his uncle's shoulder, saying he was the only one he had left. He couldn't express how grateful he was that Glodden was still on his side. The Crown Prince asked his uncle to promise that he would support him for a long time to come. The Grand Duke smiled at his highness and made his promise. Afterwards, Glodden got up as he needed to see the Crown Princess. Robilio stormed out of Esteban's residence, cursing through gritted teeth at the useless fools who had messed up planting the dream leaves. If the royal family had found it first, it would have been a perfect opportunity to get rid of the Duke. The Grand Duke thought that idiot Crown Prince didn't suspect a thing, but he wasn't too worried, hoping his time would come and he would get them all next time. Robilio was convinced that this empire rightfully belonged to him. When Glodden visited the Crown Princess, he found that she was not alone at the time. Eveline was having another meeting with Antonio. The Grand Duke wondered who the young man was, and the Crown Princess introduced him as a guest from the duchy. As Antonio introduced himself to de Robilio, he recalled hearing about this servant of de Balthazar's. He asked if de Hessen was the one who found the dream leaves at the school construction site, which he confirmed. The protagonist was very frustrated that the Grand Duke knew her true identity. Noticing Antonio's sullen face, the Crown Princess suggested they end their meeting for the day. De Hessen left Avellini's office. Meanwhile, Glawden announced he was here to amend the terms of their deal. She tried to figure out why the Grand Duke was glaring at her with such a murderous look and began to feel that de Rebelio might not be someone to mess with. As she walked down the corridor with a heavy heart, Marquis Euclid suddenly appeared before her. Despite her male attire, Johannes recognized her at a glance and called out her name. She completely forgot she was supposed to be pretending to be Antonio, greeted the Marquis, and immediately realized she had exposed herself. Hessen tried to cover up her mistake, saying she had heard a lot about Euclid from Rosalia. Johannes just listened silently to the story about how the brother and sister were always mistaken for each other. He was still trying to figure out why Cecilia was pretending to be a man. Meanwhile, Antonio was gushing, telling the Marquis how happy he was to meet him. So this was why Johannes couldn't find Rosalia, but he still didn't know what the hell she was up to. Seriously, didn't she know that blood relatives of their family could recognize each other by scent? The Marquis took Antonio's hand and said that if Rosalia was busy, they should get together sometime. When asked what he wanted, Johannes said he wasn't sure, but felt they might get along. Whatever happened, he was determined to be on Cecilia's side. That night, Alejandro reported to the Duke, updating him on the school's construction progress. But Klaus was more interested in whether the secretary had noticed anything unusual about Antonio. According to Alejandro, Hessen had met with the crown princess and then immediately ran into Marquis Euclid. After returning, he chatted with Miss Closette for a while and then went to visit Count Bernus. The guards couldn't follow him inside, so we don't have all the details, but it seems Antonio has taken a liking to the Count. The Duke had heard that Bernus was a bit mentally unstable, but he didn't see what that had to do with the Hessen. Just then, Alejandro found something strange in the security report. It looked like Antonio had run into Glawden de Rebelio at the palace. While Hessen was meeting with the crown princess, the Grand Duke decided to pay a visit to Her Highness. Klaus didn't understand why Antonio wouldn't listen to him. He had warned him to reduce contact, even with people close to him, because if the Grand Duke found out about him, things could get very ugly. Furious, the Duke ordered Alejandro to bring de Hessen before him. This brings us back to the scene where Klaus pinned Antonio against the wall. After that, he told the kid to get serious unless he wanted to die. The protagonist just stood there with her head down, not daring to say a word. Then the Duke dropped the bombshell that he wanted the three of them, him, Antonio, and Rosalia, to have dinner together. In fact, Klaus was hoping that if they all sat at the same table, he could finally figure out his true feelings. Antonio replied that it was a tempting offer, but Rosalia had been very busy lately and might not have any free time. Besides, his sister already had a boyfriend, so having dinner with another man might be a bit awkward, you know. The Duke said he wasn't trying to pull anything. He just wanted to thank the siblings who were working hard to pay him back. If the only problem was the Marquis, Klaus was prepared to write to Rosalia right now and ask her to make an exception this time. Antonio went on to say that wasn't necessary, as his sister enjoyed seeing new places and was currently on a long trip. In that case, Klaus was willing to send a carriage to pick the girl up. In any case, the Duke asked them to let him know when it was convenient for him and his sister, and he would wait until then. Antonio sighed and promised to talk it over with Rosalia. The next day, at Nadia's place, our protagonist was freaking out, thinking she was doomed this time. The painter told Antonio to calm down, or he'd pull all his hair out at this rate. She slumped over the table in despair, wondering how she could be in two places at once. Then she noticed that Nadia was the same height and build as her, so she decided to approach the painter and ask for a small favor. At first, Nadia said she was busy, but when Antonio offered to pay, she suddenly became available. De Hessen told the painter that all she needed to do was pretend to be his sister, Rosalia. To his shock, it turned out Nadia already knew Antonio's true identity. The painter found the idea amusing and agreed to play along. She thought to herself that if that guy hadn't figured out that the brother and sister were the same person, he was truly blind. To make the plan work, she left Nadia's place and headed for Marquis Euclid. Antonio told Johannes that Rosalia was in trouble and needed his help. The Marquis was more than willing to do anything for her. The operation began. The Duke and Antonio were waiting for Rosalia outside a restaurant. Klaus had wanted to eat at the mansion, but de Hessen insisted on going out for a change of scenery. She planned to make it quick. She never intended to give the Duke any chance to confess. She hoped Klaus would be as dense as usual and not suspect a thing. Finally, Rosalia appeared across the street. Antonio waved for her to come over, but she didn't even turn her head. The Duke found it strange. For the first time ever, he felt nothing for the Rosalia standing there with her back to him. Just as Antonio was about to cross the road to get to his sister, a carriage stopped in front of her, and Marquis Eucaliode stepped out. De Hessen, standing aside, almost couldn't hold back his laughter, trying to feign shock at Johannes's appearance. Meanwhile, Klaus also found it strange that while he used to get very angry seeing Rosalia with the Marquis, he now felt nothing at all. Johannes was whispering to Nadia, asking if he could touch her to make the act look more realistic. The artist agreed, and he raised his hand to stroke her hair. This encounter was starting to become meaningless for the Duke, as he realized he truly felt nothing. When the fake Rosalia and the Marquis got into the carriage and left together, Antonio feigned sadness, saying it seemed they had some urgent business. He was frustrated about having to cancel the restaurant reservation and promised they would find another good day to meet. However, the Duke suggested that since they were already out, Antonio should have lunch with him. Later, sitting in the restaurant, Klaus felt more and more certain that the person outside wasn't Rosalia. He looked at Antonio, thinking how charming he was when he ate. The Duke found himself thinking that a man was cute. He held his head in his hands, unwilling to believe it. Afterwards, our heroine met with Johannes and Nadia to thank them for their wonderful performance. Nadia told her not to worry, that she had a lot of fun and was happy to work with the Marquis. Eucaliode had urgent business, so he bid farewell to the artist and Antonio, telling them to contact him if they needed anything else. Alone with Nadia, our heroine handed over the agreed-upon payment. When she asked if the artist's financial situation was okay, Nadia said she was fine, but that she needed the cash to buy something. After saying this, Nadia suddenly started coughing violently again, just like before. Our heroine was completely stunned, as she thought Nadia's illness was getting better. Nadia repeated that. The therapist had warned her it would take some time to fully recover. Our heroine suggested finding a new doctor, but Nadia refused to listen and urged Rosalia to leave quickly. Alone, she stared at her own blood-stained palm. After returning to the Baltazar estate, she couldn't stop worrying about Nadia. She ran into the Duke on the road and greeted him. But surprisingly, Klaus said nothing and walked right past Antonio as if she didn't exist at all. The first time, she thought the Duke was just too busy. But when the same thing happened for the third time, she finally realized it all stemmed from that dinner. He had barely touched his food that day, probably because he was down about being stood up, while his clueless servant ate heartily as if nothing was wrong. She was angry at the Duke's petty behavior. He could have just said he was upset instead of acting like this. On the other hand, though, maybe this was a good thing because it was exactly what she wanted. She lay on the grass, completely unguarded, not noticing the Duke sneaking up on her like a mouse. He gazed at the sleeping Antonio, while his own mind was in chaos. Klaus sat down beside them, thinking it wouldn't hurt to let the kids sleep for a while. Gazing at the sparkling lake, the Duke remembered how it all began, from the moment he worried that Antonio might die. Klaus looked at the sleeping fellow, trying to figure out what he was feeling. Before he knew it, he was leaning over to Hessen and pressing a kiss to his lips. Suddenly, he heard Closie's voice behind him. She was in the garden, looking for Antonio. Realizing what he had just done, Klaus's face turned bright red. He shot up as if fired from a cannon and pretended he was just passing by. Closie woke Antonio up, reminding him that they had promised to go on a picnic. They didn't even notice the Duke hiding behind a nearby pillar. He touched his lips in confusion. The next day, the heroine left the estate, preparing to return to Count de Bernas. The Duke, who was also heading out, offered to give Antonio a ride. De Hessen found this strange, as Klaus had been avoiding him. But to save himself a walk, he gladly accepted. Despite this, the atmosphere in the carriage was quite heavy, as the Duke didn't say a word the whole way. Finally, Klaus broke the oppressive silence and asked Antonio why he kept visiting the Count. He asked if anyone had tried to contact Hessen recently, to which the answer was no. Then they continued on in complete silence. Upon arriving, Antonio rushed out to meet Waldo, who was waiting for him at the door. When Waldo saw the Duke, he recognized him as the son of Duke de Baltazar. The Count was completely stunned, realizing that Klaus was now the Duke. Now, Waldo, the man whose house Antonio had been desperately trying to get into, understood why this Balthazar was so tall and looked nothing like a 10-year-old child. Klaus was already saying his goodbyes, ready to leave, but the Count suddenly asked him to stay for tea. The old man was worried the Duke would blame him for making the kid come all this way without even letting him in the door. The three of them entered the estate, completely unaware of a man outside the gate watching them. Waldo remembered that the kid used to like milk cookies and asked Antonio to bring some out for their guest. De Hessen reminded the old man that it was the young lady who liked cookies, not Klaus, and asked them to bring something the boy liked. As soon as Antonio left the room, the Count's mood plummeted. Waldo told the Duke that a dark cloud was hanging over that child's head. Mr. Bernass was sure Klaus had noticed it too, that someone was targeting the boy. And because he himself was too old, he asked the Duke to take responsibility for Antonio. In his opinion, De Hessen was a rather rare kind of young man these days. From the moment they met, Antonio had done everything he could to help Waldo, even though they were strangers before. Even when everyone else left, he stayed. The Count didn't know who would want to cause trouble for such a good kid, and he wanted him to be safe, but he himself was too worn out to protect him anymore. The Duke smiled and told the old man not to worry, as his side was already handling everything. Back in the room, Antonio wondered what they had been talking about for so long. The old man, in his usual grumpy manner, said he had just scolded him, saying a helper like him was too good for this world. The Duke smiled, watching as Waldo sent Antonio to buy some candy for the guest, or whatever sweets children like. De Hessen repeated that Klaus was not a child, then sat sulking on the sofa, refusing to go anywhere. While cleaning the Count's house and tidying up, the heroine observed the Duke's behavior with surprise. She had always thought Klaus was the type to keep his distance from people, but he had really changed since she arrived here. Not only did he actually talk with Waldo, but he even smiled for some reason. After finishing all the chores in the house, Antonio said goodbye to the Count. Klaus, who had also been there all day, told the old man to take care of himself as he left. Waldo asked the Duke to come again tomorrow, as he wanted to show him something. Looking at the Count's serious face, Klaus felt that he knew something important. He promised to stop by tomorrow when he brought Antonio over again. Later, sitting in the carriage, the Duke shared his thoughts on the visit with De Hessen. Klaus had heard that the Count suffered from dementia, but he seemed much more lucid than expected. The Duke wondered to himself if the old man had become like this only after his son died in battle. Antonio thought that must be the reason. He admitted that he had decided not to bring it up with the Count for now, even though Waldo didn't even remember his son was dead. After a brief silence, the Duke agreed with him. Klaus suddenly said there was something else he was curious about, but then, as if changing his mind, he turned to the window, and they rode the rest of the way in silence. The next day, the servants at the estate made Antonio carry a heavy box to the storage room. This wasn't the first time she had noticed how much they disliked her. The men smirked, reminding Antonio that he was just a servant like them, even if he got special treatment. De Hessen obediently lifted the heavy box from the floor, trying not to provoke them or make things worse. The box was too heavy for her fragile hands, and her whole body was shaking, but she kept carrying it. The Duke appeared out of nowhere, snatched the box from Antonio's hands, and angrily asked where it was supposed to go. De Hessen, as well as all the other servants, looked at him in utter terror. Klaus repeated his question with a frown. Finally, one of the servants snatched the box from his Grace's hands, insisting that everything was fine and he would take care of it himself. Antonio thanked the Duke for his help, while the Duke was angry at him for letting those lowlifes push him around. Klaus suggested teaching the kid some fighting techniques, since they were heading to the Count's anyway. The Duke told Antonio to get going, and he followed obediently with his head down. He knew that after this incident, the other servants would hate him even more. The Duke opened the carriage door for him to get in. Antonio thanked him, but pointed out that he really didn't have to give him a ride every time, as it was a bit embarrassing for him as a servant. Klaus reminded him that he had business with the Count as well. It would be stranger if two people going to the same place traveled separately. When Klaus and Antonio arrived at the Count's estate, he wasn't there to greet them as usual for some reason. De Hessen found it strange, so he went to the study to see if Waldo was inside. Opening the door, Antonio screamed in horror. He ran with all his might toward the old man, who was lying face down on the study floor. Antonio pleaded with Waldo not to leave him and yelled that they needed a doctor urgently. The Duke picked up a piece of paper from the floor, right next to the old man, and showed it to the boy. As it turned out, the death notice for the young count had been sent to Mr. Bernass again. Klaus lifted the old man from the floor and carried him on his shoulder, believing this was done on purpose. It was hard to say who exactly, but they definitely wanted to harm the count.